Alrighty then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 131. And I'm not fully prepared yet. Just a second. I gotta enlarge the size of my questions here. Get it up to like 42 so I can see it from a distance. Okay. Now I think maybe I'm ready. Are you ready? Got my emergency backup beverage with the little paper umbrella, which signifies my class. Take a sip, and we got lots of questions. And I'm kind of starting late. Haven't even bothered to move my camera over to that desk over there, which is where I usually do it. So I got like the bookcase and the altar and stuff in the background. Not this time. Those of you who watch my videos just to see the fish gliding around silently in my aquarium in the background, you're out of luck because you're not going to be able to see it because it's like over that way. My aquarium is. And we got lots of questions. We got like 60 questions, possibly the largest number of questions ever on a Q&A. And I will conscientiously do my best, within reason, of course, to keep this thing less than 3.5 hours long. But who knows? Because I'm already digressing. I'm already talking about stuff that isn't the questions. And before I start answering questions, I seem to vaguely recall somebody somewhere asking me a question about Mothmen, and it just sort of slipped through the cracks and disappeared. Questions do this sometimes. If you ask a question and I don't answer it, there's a good chance that I just didn't see it or just kind of skipped over it somehow inadvertently. It does happen sometimes. So don't think that if you asked a question I didn't answer it, that I was offended, that because it was such an inappropriate question or some such. No, I mean, if you're deliberately being offensive or something, I might not answer a question like that, but that doesn't happen very often. So if you answered a question, or if you asked a question in good faith, I don't answer it, just ask it again, and chances are I'll see it the second time. Sometimes people will ask questions like under old Q&A videos where I don't look for questions, that kind of thing. It happens sometimes. So anyways, anyone's curious about Mothman, Mothmen plural, moth people, if we're not going to be so patriarchal. But I don't know anything about Mothman really. Just very, very little. So I think I'm just going to move on to what is technically the first question. And this is from Newman. And Newman says, how does intention work in Theravada Buddhism? For example, can someone will of their own intention to agree and adopt the teachings of the Buddha, or is there some kind of grace mechanism that causes the intention to pursue enlightenment to arise in the postulant? And for some reason, this reminds me of an essay written by William James about, I mean, you can't just believe whatever you want to believe. It's just not a viable option to just believe something because you think you ought to believe it. I mean, it doesn't work for me. It didn't work for William James. There could be some people out there who just kind of, they're somewhat invertebrate in their approach to life, and they can just believe what they're told to believe. I mean, like in a predominant, like medieval Europe, you just had to be a Catholic. And back then you really didn't see any option. It was like Catholicism was just considered to be true. And so even if it didn't seem true to you, there was some other aspect of your mind thinking, well, you know, everyone believes it, so it's got to be true. It's just there's something wrong with me in not seeing the truth of it, and so they'd follow along. But with regard to Theravada Buddhism, in a non-Theravada Buddhist culture, can you will of your own intention to agree and adopt the teachings of the Buddha? I know maybe some people, but it doesn't work for me. I mean, you have to be persuaded. You have to think that it's true, or at least you have to consider it to be more true than your other options. So, yeah, it's not really a grace mechanism. It could be a karmic preparation thing where you just have the karmic predisposition to accept Dhamma. But still, I mean, it has to strike you as true and worthwhile in order for you to accept it and believe it. I mean, you can kind of go along with the motions without being completely persuaded. I mean, I'm not completely persuaded of much of anything really, but still, I mean, it does have to seem like a viable option. And so I'm not sure exactly how intention fits into this. I mean, Newman asks, how does intention work in Theravada Buddhism? That's the question. That's the question mark comes after that. How does intention work in Theravada Buddhism? In which you might say that, intention is like karma itself. Volition is karma, chetanaham bhikkhave kamam vadami, that kind of thing. But then his example that follows that is what I just addressed. And I think I addressed it well enough for such a long Q&A as this may turn out to be. So I think I should move on to Newman's second question, which is, if someone with wrong view, for example, belief in God or gods, essentialist metaphysics, etc., practices meditation as understood by Buddhists in which initiation isn't necessary, is it effective in the sense of CD developing or psychic powers in general, or propelling one towards enlightenment, although they don't currently hold the right view necessary for it at that time? Well, when you're meditating, you're pretty much suspending wrong view. I mean, if you're sitting in meditation, like on the breath, for example, and you're philosophizing and holding on to like theological views or essentialist philosophical views, you're not really meditating. So while you're meditating, your wrong view just evaporates if you're meditating properly, for the most part. I mean, you might think that the breath is real when you're breathing and that kind of thing, which is kind of technically still wrong view, but it's a matter of degree, I guess. And still, people who have really wrong views can make progress in Dhamma. Golden example, Saint John of the Cross. Believed in God Almighty, believed Jesus died for his sins, believed Mary was a virgin, was furthermore essentially an arahant. And he may have become an arahant himself despite these dogmatic views, because the more progress you make in meditation, the more detached you are from mere thinking. And the mere thinking, which contains these wrong views, becomes less and less essential to your spiritual practice, less and less essential to your understanding of reality. So St. John of the Cross started off as a devout Spanish Catholic in the 1500s and continued being a devout Spanish Catholic. I mean, he's a Catholic saint now. He's the mystical doctor of the Catholic Church. But his practice was extremely advanced, and his teachings became more and more similar to Buddhism. But, I mean, he couldn't just deny the truth of Catholic teachings, because the Inquisition was breathing down his neck, and he had already almost died in prison as for a kind of religious persecution. Not because of his views so much in that case, but because he was part of a reform movement of the Carmelite order of monks and nuns. And so the unreformed Carmelites got revenge and accused him of these trumped up charges, and he wound up in prison and almost died. And he might have died if he hadn't escaped. Well, that's neither here nor there. The point is that St. John of the Cross was much more advanced than most Buddhists are, despite the fact he believed in an eternal and immortal soul, God Almighty, Jesus as God's only begotten Son who died for our sins, etc., Mary, virgin, enlightened virgin, etc. So, yeah, I'm not one of those fundamentalist Theravada Buddhists who think that you have to believe orthodox Theravada Buddhist philosophy or you're just lost. You don't have any chance, and probably you're going to wind up in a lower realm. I don't subscribe to that. So you can have wrong views, still become enlightened, because the wiser you get, the more progress you make in your meditation, the more detached you are from views. You just don't identify with views anymore, even though they're still there as a kind of cultural artifact. So, I mean, that's one reason why I'm so open-minded with regard to members of other religions, for example, being fully enlightened, because you just eventually detach from the dogmas. The dogmas do not contain the essence of Dhamma anyway. They're a raft made of rubbish that you use to cross the flood, and then you let it go when you get to the other side, because it's not something that should be really clung to due to any inherent, like, profound truth. It's skillful means, as the Mahayana Buddhists call it. And so I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Gnostic Rocker. And Gnostic Rocker says, what is your view on the following observation by scholar of religious cultures and nationalism, Ernest Gellner? And so he continues, Gnostic Rocker. This is Gnostic Rocker still, not Ernest Gellner yet. In Gellner's Nations and Nationalism, he theorizes that in shamanistic pre-agrarian cultures, men profess to worship nature, river, and mountain spirits, but in reality they are worshiping themselves. He theorizes that in agrarian cultures, men worshipped, dreaded, bowed down to, and feared God, but in reality they were fearing and worshiping the austere power over life and death that the kings held. Period. In nationalism, Gellner informs us men worship race, bloodlines, ancestors, and what they understand to be unique genes, but in turning into a fetish and worshiping themselves. From what I have observed of life, Gellner seems to have a point. If there is some truth at all in the above analysis regarding subconscious or hidden obscured motivations in men, then what are Theravada or Mahayana Buddhists subconsciously worshiping or devoting themselves to? Well, first of all, I don't think that Gellner was entirely right. I do think that throughout history, there have been people worshiping God that were really worshiping what they considered to be God and not just themselves. Although I will say that all religions are idolatrous to some degree, because what you're worshiping is a creation of your own mind. It wasn't necessarily made by human hands, but it's made by human ideas. So in a way, anything that you worship is going to be a production of your own mind. I mean, you can say you're worshiping God, you're worshiping ultimate truth, you're worshiping, the Dharmakaya, nirvana, supposedly something that is eternal, that existed before you, but your understanding of it is a creation of your own mind. And that's really what you're worshiping. So, I mean, to some degree, it's not nearly as political or what's the word? I want to say socialistic, but not with regard to socialism as with regard to sociological. It's not so political or sociological as Gellner is saying, where deep down maybe they have an inkling that they're really worshiping themselves. I really think that most religious people are sincere, that they're not just sort of worshiping themselves through the back door, so to speak. But at the same time, like I said, all religions are somewhat idolatrous in that you are attributing holiness or sacredness to something that is artificial, created by humans, not so much by human hands as by the human mind. And that's pretty much unavoidable unless you're just going to be a kind of atheist. You have the choice of being an idolater or an atheist, but you'd have to be a humble atheist that isn't worshiping atheism as some kind of highest truth. So, getting down to the question though, let's see. Gellner seems to have a point. If there is some truth at all in the above analysis regarding subconscious or hidden, obscured motivations in men, then what are Theravada or Mahayana Buddhists subconsciously worshiping or devoting themselves to? Their own understanding of Dharma. Because Dharma itself, I mean, if you don't conceptualize it, you're oblivious to it, unless you get into a really deep mystical state, which most people don't. So, yeah, in a way, you'd be subconsciously revering your own best understanding of Dhamma, this concept of Buddha and Dhamma that you kind of project out there, which is really in here. And that's the way it is with all religions. And I do not think it's nearly as political as Gellner is saying. And so I'm just going to move on to Gnostic Rocker's third question, which is, I have read Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, but little of the I Ching. Professor Richard Wilhelm, in his Princeton University analysis of the I Ching, posits that the I Ching is a Chinese dialectical resolution between two opposing visions of being. The Indian Buddhist view that all existence is no more than illusion, and the Chinese philosophy of existence, which regards existence as real, a thing in itself, a noumenon, behind that illusion of becoming. Thus, the I Ching resolves the contradiction of these two opposites, and like the above, everything we know moves in opposites. Have you studied the I Ching, and what did you make of it in the light of the above? I never really studied the I Ching. I knew this girl in college that had I Ching. She didn't have the yarrow stock. She had to use coins or something. I did my reading. You know, you just kind of throw the coins and then you look at the pattern and you look it up in the book, and it gives you like this little thing about the king is going to be successful if this or that, you know, something. I don't recall the details. So I haven't really studied the I Ching, or especially like not the metaphysics, like the metaphysical underpinnings, the philosophical suppositions of the I Ching. You know, I've just considered it to be a kind of fortune-telling device. That the philosophy of it, I don't know. I don't know really, you know, what kind of metaphysical assumptions are made in the I Ching, whether it's largely Buddhist or Taoist or Confucianist or anything like that. Sorry about that. But really, the I Ching is not a kind of Dharma that is studied as Dharma, really, by most people. You think of Chinese religion, I Ching generally isn't on the list. So, this is like a fourth question. Oh, man. Oh, no, this is a third question. Okay. Gnostic Rocker, you're off the hook, because I guess you did just ask 3 questions here. Third question. Have you ever mentioned to your fellow workers that you are Buddhist? If so, then how did they react? I never do tell colleagues nowadays, since when did so in the past, I was made fully aware of how far away most Western people, and indeed most East Asians also, are from understanding Eastern religions. I wonder what happened in your case if you told colleagues, since you were a monastic for so long in conditions most Westerners wouldn't understand. Yeah, I mean, I'm working among blue-collar workers in the Bible Belt of the United States. And the place where I'm working at now, it wasn't until yesterday that I mentioned that I was a Buddhist to anybody. I mean, there are few people, you know, they're just talkative. I don't know if they're really curious or just talkative. You know, they'll be asking questions, you know, where are you from? And this kind of thing. And so, you know, I'd have to mention now, I spent a lot of time in Asia. And it's like, why? And I just kind of like deflect and just wouldn't say that I was a Buddhist monk, because I might as well say that for the past 30 years I was with Elvis on a UFO with aliens or something. Although yesterday, this guy, he asked me, what religion or nationality are you? And I was like, well, do I get to pick? I mean, is it one or the other? I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm American. And he said he was too. And then he informed me that he was Jewish, which is kind of surprising. You don't expect to see, like a light brown haired Jewish person who doesn't look Jewish driving a forklift in South Carolina. They're all supposed to be like doctors and lawyers and movie producers and that kind of thing. So anyways, then he did pursue this and asked me what religion. I said, well, I'm more Theravada Buddhist than anything else. And then the reason he asked is because, according to him, my mannerisms remind him of this really cool guy that he knows who is a Mormon. So I guess he was sort of fishing to find out if I was a Mormon too, because I act like this Mormon friend of his or remind him of this Mormon friend of his. And so that's as far as it went. And I don't know if he would ever pursue it because, again, you tell a blue collar worker in the Bible Belt of the United States, South Carolina, about that you're a Buddhist or were a Buddhist, and it just doesn't, it's like tilt on the old pinball machine. It's like they don't know how to process the information. Although the very first place I worked here in South Carolina, everyone knew I was a monk because the manager was like, we're going to have a monk working here, before I even showed up. A lot of them were skeptical. They just thought I was just making it up and that I was really in prison for 30 years or something. Anyways, I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from... It's spelled QXZTK. So Q says, I am curious about dependent origination. I get the links from sense to clinging, but from ignorance to six sense bases, it is hard for me to see the causal connection in each step, especially name and form to six sense bases. Also, from clinging to aging seems confusing. Cling to becoming seems especially odd to me, and should we view both as undesirable, presumably Buddhists and not anti-natalist as far as I know, but I may be wrong. So presumably Buddhists are not anti-natalist as far as I know, but I may be wrong. Some of this seems to fit into the common criticism that Buddhism is anti-life. I am somewhat sympathetic to that argument, though many other aspects of Buddhism keep calling out to me, making me unable to ignore it. Perhaps you can clarify for me. Well, this is kind of more than one question in a way. It's a complex question anyhow. But with regard to dependent origination, as I've pointed out time and time again, I do not consider the 12 links to be original teachings of the Buddha. That if you look in the text, you can find proto-dependent co-arising of like precursors, prototypes of the 12-link theory. For example, the Kalahawiwada Sutta of the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, or the central portion of the Sakapanya Sutta in the Digha Nikaya contain like proto-Paticca Samuppadas, like the 12 Nidana theory. And really, I have to agree with that the 12 Nidanas don't make very good sense. Like, for example, between feeling and craving, there ought to be like perception or something in there, but there isn't. And also there's two terms that mean the same thing. Like, let's see, avijja, sankhara towards the beginning of the 12 nidanas, and also bhava towards the end, both mean essentially kamma. So, I mean, it could short circuit it. You just skip over the whole middle, go from one comma to the next, because they mean the same thing, and just there you go. You just got rid of the whole central part of it through a short circuit, if you will. But let's see. From ignorance to six sense bases, it is hard for me to see the causal connection in each step. So avijja paccaya sankhara, which is, I mean, if you go with orthodox interpretation, then it's like this is referring to the past, the previous existence. previous ignorance resulted in previous making of karma, and then it results in like consciousness, which is rebirth linking consciousness in this life. And then you've got like namarupa, which is mind and body according to orthodox interpretation, the six sense bases. So it's like the first three steps are the previous existence according to the orthodox interpretation, and then it results in this existence. And name and form to the six sense bases. Well, when you have a mind and a body, let's say you've got the fertilized egg would be the simplest name and form, presuming that the fertilized egg has some tiny little speck of consciousness to it. And then gradually it develops into the six sense bases. You've got the six senses, including mind as sixth. So that doesn't strike me as too difficult to understand if you're willing to accept the orthodox interpretation of what I consider to be an anachronism anyway, and probably not an original teachings of the Buddha. Also, he says, from clinging to aging seems confusing. Cling to becoming seems especially odd. Well, I mean, partly you're dealing with like English, like makeshift interpretations. Like clinging, the word in Pali is upadana, which literally means uptake, and it also could mean fuel, like firewood in the Buddhist time, in like colloquial Pali, or the language similar to Pali that was spoken in the Ganges Valley where the Buddha lived. Upadana could mean just firewood, but it means uptake. And so you've got like craving, thirst, which causes you to take up and cling to things. And then the bhava, which is usually translated as becoming or whatever, that's karma. It's like the force of existence. It's like the momentum of your mental states that keeps you going through samsara. So it's like the clinging to stuff, it's like the fuel for your karmic journey through samsara. So that's not too difficult to understand if you think about it in terms of the original Pali and don't rely too heavily on makeshift English renderings of the terms. But again, I really do not think the Buddha originally taught dependent co-arising as 12 links. It was more like, this being that is, this becoming that becomes, this not, let's see, I'm forgetting the short version, but it's essentially, this not being that is not. This being that is, this not being that is not. I mean, that's like the condensed version of the short version. And it's just sort of like conditionality. It's not this sequence of things. And some famous Western monks, like Jnanavira especially, I think, interpreted the whole 12 links to be authentic but simultaneous, not like a linear sequence. He keeps pointing out, it says, this being that is, not this ceasing that is. But it's just kind of an academic argument. You can study, the orthodox interpretation of it, which is helpful, but still logically, it's not a very elegant theory, in my opinion. It could be fixed up more than it already is, and it's already apparently a fixed up version of earlier attempts. Or, I mean, the earlier attempts aren't even identified as paticca samuppada. It was just like, what causes this? And then the Buddha answers. And then they say, well, what causes that? And then the Buddha answers. And then, well, what causes that? And you wind up with this chain of this causes this, causes this, causes this. And that somehow evolved into an interpretation of dependent co-arising, because as the Buddha correctly predicted, right after his enlightenment, almost nobody understands dependent co-arising. And so it just like crystallized into this 12 links. And then monks just memorize that and think that they understand it when really they still don't. And even the longest sutta on dependent co-arising, the Nibbana Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, even that doesn't have the standard 12 links. It was like an early prototype, but then it got worked on even since the composition of that sutta, so that you've got like the streamlined 12 links, and probably, in my opinion, perception should have been thrown in there, but 13 links is less auspicious than 12, I guess. So, I guess the next question, let's see, gotta separate these. I don't like having them clumped together. So it's like, next question is, presumably Buddhists are not anti-natalist as far as I know, but I may be wrong. Some of it seems to fit into the common criticism that Buddhism is anti-life. I am somewhat sympathetic. Okay, perhaps you can clarify for me. Well, I mean, the first noble truth is if you exist, you're going to suffer. And the best thing you can do is try to stop suffering. So it is kind of anti-natalist to that extent. And the early, like the Vedic Brahmins, the followers of Vedic Brahmanism in the Buddhist time, accused the Buddhists of being destroyers of life because, or at least partly because, the Brahmins had this idea that first you should be a householder and have kids before you renounce the world, whereas the Buddhists are saying renounce the world as soon as you can, preferably before you have kids. So Vedic Brahmanism was more conducive to the sustaining of Indian society, whereas in Buddhism, it's sort of like modern Western Christianity, where most people just aren't very good Christians. I mean, there actually is an epistle in the New Testament saying that if you are single when you become a Christian, you should stay single. And if you're married when you become a Christian, you should stay married, because Jesus is coming anytime now. And I mean, how many Christians follow that? There's so much in the New Testament that in order for it to become like a secular mass religion, this stuff needs to be ignored. So it's kind of that way in Theravada Buddhism, where at least it's sort of stratified. So if you want to really be serious about following the system correctly, you renounce the world, you go off into the forest and meditate. Whereas the lay people who consider themselves to be Buddhist, they realize that they're not practicing Buddhism entirely correctly. In a way, Theravada Buddhism was set up as a kind of spectator sport, where the monks and nuns are like the pro athletes, and the lay people are just like fans supporting their favorite team. And in the West, people resent that. And to some degree, a lot of Western Buddhists, so-called, resent renunciation and like people who do renounce the world, because it somehow makes their own lukewarmness and mediocre practice seem not good enough somehow. So in a way, Buddhism kind of is anti-natalist. You know, it does teach kind of what Ecclesiastes teaches in the Bible, that you're better off just not being born. And if you are born, which most of us are, then, I mean, the thing to do is just get off the wheel. Just stop, just cut it out. Knock it off, for crying out loud. So it's kind of anti-life. The whole purpose is to transcend this dim, glimmery fever dream of samsaric existence into something better. Better than mere samsaric existence, which is also called life by some people. But it's not ultimately real. You know, you're transcending an illusion. It's not like you're just like pissing on life on earth. It's just there is a higher reality than this fever dream generated by life on earth, so to speak. And I should just move on to this question. Really, we got lots of questions. I shouldn't dwell too long on any question in particular unless I just happen to feel like it. Because after all, this is my show. Next question is from Romeo. And Romeo says, were you a fan of the Beatles? Well, the Beatles were before my time. They broke up in 1972. I was a kid. wasn't really sophisticated in my musical taste, I'd be listening to KGHO in Aberdeen, which just played top 40 stuff, if I hear the radio at all. I didn't own my own radio probably yet at that time. But I would say the top 3 rock and roll bands, I mean, Led Zeppelin and the Beatles would be the top 2, and I'm not even sure who number 3 would be. So I do think that the Beatles are one of the 2 greatest rock bands of all time. So I don't know if that makes me a fan or not. I'm just sort of acknowledging just based on my own analysis of, the qualities of rock and roll bands, then I would consider the Beatles to be in the top 2 along with Led Zeppelin. So Romeo's second question, and he does kind of have 4 questions here, although they're kind of all along the same lines. If so, can you speak about what you liked about them? Well, they were groundbreaking pioneers. They were very innovative. They just transformed rock and roll and pop music, just on their own practically, especially after they started taking acid and grew their hair long. And also, they were just good musicians. I mean, you listen to a classic Beatles song, like, say, Strawberry Fields Forever. I mean, it's really sophisticated music. It's not just some garage band just banging, grinding, and pounding out some song. But some garage band types are really good. AC/DC, they were simplistic. The stuff they played could be played by some junior high school band without much difficulty. But still, the Beatles they had a certain sophistication in addition to like inspired innovation. So that's what I liked about them, I guess. Like Within Me Without You. Is that how it goes? Within Me Without You with sitar. I think that was one of I can't remember his name. The bass player. George Harrison. He was allowed like 2 songs per album. George Harrison got to write 2 songs per Beatles album with John and Paul, doing the rest, kind of collaborating on the rest. And so George Harrison did most of like the Hindu inspired spiritual kind of songs, like Within Me Without You with the sitar music. But I think I'm kind of rambling at this point. So do you have a favorite albums or favorite songs? It's kind of interesting. Before I became a monk, when I was still like a white-robed, like a postulant, a monastery attendant at the monastery where I was ordained, just one day washing dishes in the kitchen building, I was trying to come up with a Beatles song to represent each person at the monastery. Like there was this abrasive Jewish guy who a lot of people didn't like him. I liked him though. And he was Happiness is a Warm Gun. My theme song was Nowhere Man. It's not exactly one of my favorite songs though. It just seemed to fit me at the time. But again, Within Me Without You is one of my favorite Beatles songs. Also, my favorite Beach Boys song of all time is Back in the USSR by the Beatles. So, favorite albums? I don't know if I have a favorite album. I mean, Sgt. Pepper is classic. I mean, that was one of those innovative, just completely groundbreaking kind of albums. Sort of their, like Rubber Soul and Revolver before that were good. The White Album was getting kind of bleak at times. But yeah, I mean, I'm not really into Beatles music before they grew their hair long and started taking hard drugs. When they became hippies, that's really when they blossomed, in my opinion. They were already really famous before that, but there you are. So if not, what didn't I like about them? The main thing I didn't like about the Beatles is Paul McCartney, who was not really a rock and roller. He was more of a pop musician. And so, in my opinion, most of the real dud songs on their albums, like She's Leaving Home on Sgt. Pepper, just an insufferably bad song, in my opinion. They're almost all written by Paul McCartney. So I do think that Paul McCartney was little too much of a pop musician, not enough of a rock and roller to really have the Beatles be like Led Zeppelin, where just everybody in the band was like top notch in what they did, up until John Paul Jones started preferring keyboards to bass. That was the beginning of the end. That was driving John Bonham to drink really hard, probably. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, hello, Panyo. Do you know when the term yogi first appeared in a Theravadan context? Well, yogi definitely is a Pali word in addition to a Sanskrit one. It's used a lot in Theravada. In Burma, yogi means like a meditator, especially a female meditator, like a lay meditator is called a yogi. In fact, yogi yawn or yogi color is kind of a dark brown, and that's the women, the Burmese Buddhist women who just sort of dedicate their lives to meditation and keeping precepts and all that. They'll often wear this dark brown color, which is yogi color. But it is true that in the oldest suttas, the word yogi isn't used. Excuse me. Yoga is found in old text. It means like the yoke, like a yoga kema is a term that's found in very early Buddhist texts, which just means like rest from the yoke. It's like release from bondage kind of a thing. But yoga as like a spiritual practice came later. I mean, as a word meaning that in Pali, in the text, I have read that one of the oldest mentions of the word yogi is in the Therigatha. So that's canonical. It's relatively old, but it really takes off. It's used a lot, like in the Visuddhimagga, the commentarial literature, that kind of thing. It's well established as a term by then, but it's not found in the oldest suttas, like the strata of the suttas. But like I say, yeah, it is in the Therigatha, and it means yogi. It means just like a spiritual practitioner, especially a dedicated, relatively advanced one. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Avenity. And Avenity says, I have some basic knowledge of Buddhism, but it's kind of all over the place. Could you make a Buddhism for Dummies video or something so that I could get a grasp on how all the aspects of the Buddhism philosophy fall into place? That would be neat. And yeah, in fact, I could have done it this weekend, but I wound up doing a video right before this one with Otto Excelsior and a guy named Satori D about like artificial sentience, like programming real consciousness into a computer. And I don't know if I'm going to upload it onto my own channel. Probably not, but you can probably find it on the Otto's Navakavada channel on BitChute. I think he's started a Navakavada channel on YouTube also. He's going more mainstream now that the mainstream is somewhat less censorious and insane. But yeah, Buddhism for Dummies video, or like intro to elementary Buddhism 101. Yeah, I might do that next weekend if I'm not completely distracted by having to do other things. But it is a good idea, and I think I'll do that. So I'm not making any absolute promises, but inshallah, I will do it. And relatively, maybe even next weekend. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Siovaksha and Sipad Zidana. And his first question, which is more of a command, let's call it a request, is explain this map. And he's got a map of Burma. And Burma is divided up into this patchwork. And each patch on the map is like who is in charge of that area of Burma. The junta, the official Burmese government, is less than half of the map of Burma. And then you've got these other groups like the People's Defense Force, the Kachin Independence Army, the Arakan Army, etc., etc. It's just a veritable patchwork. And Burma has pretty much always been this way since independence. The names have changed. Like for a while, after Burma got independence, that there was the Kuomintang, I think they're called. They were the followers of Chiang Kai-shek in like after they got driven out of China, after China became communist under Mao. There was a large number of these Chinese soldiers just set up their own little country in northern Burma for years. And so Burma has always been this way. I mean, ever since independence, they've been at war with the Karens. If anyone who watched that fourth Rambo movie would know. So, yeah, that's essentially what it's about, is that Burma has always been ineptly run. The Burmese just cannot organize very well at all. That, in my opinion, one of the worst calamities ever to befall the country of Burma was independence from the British Empire. Although the Burmese just don't see it that way for some peculiar reason, explicable only to themselves, perhaps. So that's what the map is. It's just the various areas of Burma that are under the nominal control of various, the government plus various insurgent groups. And Burma has pretty much always been this way since they got independence from the British Empire. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Siovakchen Sipad Zirna. And he says, I saw a brutal comment on YouTube. What would you advise this person? And so what follows is this person and their comment. And this person says, the older I get, the angrier I feel about some of the stuff my parents taught me growing up. I was always the straight A student, never got in trouble, didn't drink or smoke, and only started dating when I turned 18 because of all the negative messages and threats of punishment they said they'd dish out if I ever did. Now I'm in my 30s, and my mom keeps telling me about all the stuff she and my dad got up to when they were younger, and they would have killed me for doing. They laugh about it, but I push so much of myself down to make them happy, and it turns out they were already doing those things themselves. I don't know where to go from here, but life feels really hollow and I don't trust them anymore. Well, for starters, he just seems like a whiner to me. That may sound brutal in and of itself, but it's like different people react to the same circumstance. I mean, that's just kind of standard. Everybody, parents are always like trying to teach their kids, don't do the shit I did when I was young. They might not put it in those words, but it's like they've learned from their mistakes. They're trying to pass off this wisdom secondhand to the kids so the kids don't have to make the same mistakes. And some kids just resent that. I mean, there are so many people who they're like traumatized throughout life because their parents got divorced when they were like 9 or 10, let's say. Or they find out that they were adopted, and then they're like, oh, I was this accident. I was a mistake. I mean, it's like other people, they find out that they're adopted, their parents get divorced. Like my parents got divorced when I was like 8 or 9 years old. And that's just the way life is. You just accept the way things are. And so, suffering is always self-inflicted. So this person isn't unhappy because his parents, assuming it's a he, his parents, made him, or like they strongly urged him, sometimes with threats of punishment, to be a good student and not get in trouble and do the right thing. It's like, I forgot how the sentence started, but it's like, what's wrong with that really? It's self-inflicted suffering. Oh yeah, now I remember. He's not suffering because his parents did this. He's suffering because he just won't accept the situation. And that's just the way suffering is. It's not the situation that makes you suffer. It is your own choice to reject the situation, to refuse to accept it. It doesn't matter what it is. If you accept it, it's not a problem. And it doesn't matter what it is. If you refuse to accept it, it's a problem. It could be somebody loving you and you think, well, I don't want to be loved by this person. And so you suffer because you're like pushing against the way things are. Not that you have to live with that person just because they love you. But still, you don't have to be against. You don't have to just... I mean, this is, Buddhism 101 that even most Buddhists don't really fully comprehend is really the second noble truth. All suffering is caused by desire, and generally desire for things to be different. Things to be different than they are. If you desire something to be different than it is, you suffer. And it's your own choice. Ultimately, you have the choice. But most people are so driven by just knee-jerk reflex, just habit, that they don't even acknowledge that they have a choice. Maybe they're living in a culture like Western consumeristic culture where it's just assumed that if you're going to be inconvenienced or uncomfortable, then you're going to suffer. It's just, people just believe that, and it's false. You always have a choice, unless you're just so semi-conscious that you fail to see that you have a choice. It may be that your karma is such, karma is like habit energy. It's just going to drive you in the direction of being unhappy just through habit, because it's your habit to be unhappy about certain things. But still, if you're mindful, at least you can observe the unhappiness with detachment, which then robs it of its motive force. It robs it of its momentum, and then it can just run its course. You can observe it dispassionately if possible, and you're not making new karma that is just reinforcing the habit. So it does take some work. But I knew this woman. She was relatively well versed in Buddhism. She taught English to the Tibetan monks at Dharamsala in India for a while. And she was telling me once that she had a very indulgent father. She had very indulgent parents who just made life easy for her. And she's been processing that. She's been trying to overcome this, for X number of years. It's like, what? My parents got divorced when I was 9. I didn't like it much, but then, there's certain perks to it. You get 2 different sets of Christmas presents, 2 different sets of birthday presents every year. There's certain advantages to it. So it's mainly a matter of attitude, whether having parents making you behave yourself, even though they didn't behave themselves very well when they were your age. You can resent that if you choose, or you can accept that if you choose. And if you accept it, it's not a problem. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid said, if the Buddha has completely rid desires, why does he still do anything rather than lean back against the Bodhi tree and wait to pass into Parinibbana? This makes me go along with the interpretation that when he achieves enlightenment, he completely disappears from samsara, and that everything anyone else sees of him after that is the fruition of their karma alone. Trying to second guess the subjective mental states of a Sammasam Buddha is already a fool's errand, I would say. But still, I think there is a lot of sense in the idea that once a person is fully enlightened, there's really nobody there, and that what they do and say is a reflection of the karmic fruition of the people around them more than of themselves. Or you could just say that an enlightened being, kind of like St. John of the Cross's conception of a Catholic enlightened being, that according to St. John of the Cross, once a person has reached the stage of perfection, which shouldn't really exist in Christianity because nobody's worthy, it's only the grace of God that gets you into heaven and all that. But according to St. John of the Cross, there is this stage of perfection where the renunciant mortifies their own self-will until they just don't have any self-will anymore, and they're totally motivated by the will of God. They become like a divine puppet. In Buddhism, you can't really have that because there is no Yahweh up there who's like the creator God, like the capital G God. So in Buddhism, you might just say that an enlightened being just automatically does the right thing. It's just, he just does the perfect thing. And if the perfect thing just happens to be, postponing death in order to teach people Dhamma, then that's fine. I mean, according to the text, the Buddha did have compassion, anukampan, and also he taught his own disciples that they should go out and teach Dhamma for the benefit of the people, for the benefit of this generation. He was a teacher of gods and men, or lords and men, I should say. Lords and common men is an alternative translation to that. So let's see here. But yeah, again, I mean, the Buddha's mind is going to be off the scale. It's not really going to be analyzable through samsaric means. And so you're better off just not even trying to go there. And so I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's next question, which is along the same lines here. Is the Buddha always happy, or does he feel nothing at all? I think this is the main hang-up for people when you introduce them to Buddhism, because they assume happiness and suffering necessarily need to both exist for there to be any happiness. While listening to Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations of some suttas, I heard it mentioned that a monk should have no likes or dislikes. Not liking anything seems to imply never being happy. However, monks of various religious traditions are happier than everyone else. This seems like something you just have to experience for yourself to understand. Well, in Buddhism, you do have the duality of like sukha and dukkha, happiness and unhappiness, that they're like a dualistic pair that just kind of come together. You get one, you get the other also. It's two sides of the same coin. But there's like a deeper kind of happiness, which is just contentment of just transcending the whole duality. And the Buddha's mind also is going to transcend the whole duality. So even if he does appear to have mental states, he does appear to have like emotions, feelings, even preferences. Like the Buddha seemed to prefer quiet to noise, for example. Then it's just sort of like this, it's just sort of like empty. It no longer has any karmic motive force subjectively. And what else was I going to say? I mean, it's just, it's there, but it has been transcended. And so it's kind of there. I mean, it was never really there to begin with. It's all just this like conditional quasi-reality anyway. And I'm just going to have to move on because we got lots of questions. It's like 60 questions this time, which is possibly the most questions ever on a Q&A. And so I just got to keep driving through this. So, Xenothoid's third question. People often question Christians and Muslims if God can defy the laws of logic and do things that we think are impossible, such as simultaneously existing and not existing. Can the Buddha do things which are impossible? I found this video reading Julius Evola's analysis of a sutta which implies that he can, although I've also heard versions of this story where the Buddha simply moves up to a higher Brahma world rather than completely disappearing. However, completely disappearing then later reappearing is obviously the more profound of the two. If he really completely existed samsara before his bet with Baka Brahma, shouldn't he also be able to return to samsara after death, as many Mahayanists believe? Sorry for the transgressive fourth question. I will save it for the next Q&A. Yeah, I don't know if that was a transgressive fourth question. At least I've just got 3 clumps of words, 3 paragraphs here. Maybe he slipped in a question mark that, yeah, I guess he does have 2 question marks in this long, complicated question. So, can the Buddha do something impossible? No, nobody can do anything that's impossible, because the word impossible means nobody can do it. So, I mean, the Christian God can't do anything impossible, because the very fact that he's doing it proves that it's possible. So, yeah, I mean, the Buddha can do things that are paradoxical, like kind of existing and not existing at the same time, sort of. I mean, he's sort of here, but he's also like transcended and is off the scale at the same time, in nirvana and samsara simultaneously. I mean, it's kind of paradoxical, but it's obviously not impossible. If, that is, he managed to do it, because the very fact that he managed to do something proves that it's not impossible. Where, I mean, this whole thing about going up to Baka Brahma's realm, I mean, Baka Brahma is still in samsara. He's just in a heaven realm. And the fact that he's called Baka Brahma proves or indicates that it's a kind of religious propaganda making fun of Baka Brahma, because Baka literally means something like a crane, kind of bird. And Brahma's usual bird that he's associated with is the ruddy shell duck, which looks like a wild goose. Hamsa. In Pali and Sanskrit, it's Hamsa. Like Paramahamsa Yogananda. Paramahamsa means ultimate goose, or more correctly, ultimate ruddy shell duck. Why a shell duck? If there are any ornithologists who watch this, I would like to know why a shell duck is called a duck and not a goose. Because they're big like a goose, got a long neck like a goose, honk like a goose. Why is it a duck? Maybe it's just sort of like a kind of parallel evolution where this family of ducks just grew into geese, separate from the main line of geese or something. But that's neither here nor there. Baka Brahma, I mean, he's identified with like a crane, which sort of like in Aesop's fables is sort of indicative in like Indian folklore as being a foolish kind of bird. So the Buddha goes up to Baka Brahma, and Baka Brahma makes a fool of himself in the sutta, and it's still in samsara. So there's really no paradox or impossibility involved at all. The Buddha just goes up into a heaven realm, comes back down again, no problem. So, but if he completely exited samsara during his bet with Baka Brahma, well, I don't know. I mean, if he made a bet with Baka Brahma, it's been a long time since I read the sutta. So maybe Xenothoid, is this Xenothoid? I think it's Xenothoid. Yeah, Xenothoid is, maybe he remembers a detail of the sutta where the Buddha leaves samsara, but he would just be going into Nibbana temporarily, but he would still have his body and everything. So he would just sort of, maybe his consciousness would vacate the body and then re-enter it. But the whole sutta is probably fiction, because it's pretty clearly religious propaganda making fun of Vedic conceptions of Brahma as some supreme god. Whereas the Buddha goes up there and makes a fool of this same supposedly supreme god. So, yeah, not only many Mahayanists believe that the Buddha can come back after death, but a lot of the Thai forest tradition, Ajahn Mun especially, believe that Buddhas, like from previous eons, can somehow just reincorporate, just generate a new body and just come and talk to Ajahn Mun. And it just doesn't work that way in Orthodox Theravada, but the Thai forest tradition, Thai monks in general, they never fully recovered from having their ecclesiastical hierarchy destroyed by the Burmese during some unprovoked invasion hundreds of years ago. So, yeah. Shouldn't he also be able to return to samsara after death? I mean, from where? I mean, nirvana is not a place. It's just this unconditioned reality that, suddenly it becomes conditioned. You could have somebody's karma generate some semblance of a Buddha coming and talking to you. You believe firmly enough, or your karma is just right for some being to manifest and communicate with you. That's fine, but it's not really the Buddha. It's just this manifestation provoked by your own karma, your own mental states or whatever. And I just got to keep going here. I just got to wade through this. This next question is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libra Lamb and occasionally still known as Libra Lamb. And he says, anything liminal on your mind today? Well, this whole talk about transcending samsara that has occurred a few times so far in this Q&A, that's kind of liminal. lately, not necessarily today, but I have been thinking about a question that I answered in the previous Q&A about dark wisdom, about kind of the wisdom of militarism. And in a way, that's kind of liminal too. I've been tempted to do a little video on that also, although it's like bottled lightning. I was inspired to talk more about it, and now it's the lightning is kind of fizzled out, I think. So I'm not nearly as motivated to talk about it this now as I was a few days ago. And I did the video with Otto. I'm not going to be doing 3 videos on one weekend unless some of them are really short ones, like teensy ones. So yeah, not especially, other than just kind of some of these questions. Almost any Q&A, I got to go liminal in trying to explain 2 different levels of reality simultaneously. He's talking about enlightenment is liminal, unless you've got like this Burmese dogmatic mechanistic cookbook understanding of things where you can just lock the most exalted ideas into this framework of words and memorize the words and think you understand it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Otto. This is the first time Otto has asked a question on these Q&As that I can recall anyway. It's been a while at any rate. And Otto's question is, quote, "I pray to God to make me a better Buddhist," unquote. And then he says, legit? And that would depend on what you mean by legit, legitimate. I mean, is that a valid? I mean, if it works, pragmatically it's legit. If you're praying to God gives you an increase in faith or self-confidence to practice Buddhism, eventually you'd like outgrow the idea. But like I've said before, you can start off with lame motivations or lame ideas about practicing, but the more you practice, the more your wisdom is going to develop, and then it's like your reasons get wiser. You might start off with foolish reasons, but if they're at least wise enough to get you practicing Dhamma, then they're good enough at that stage until you've outgrow them and then acquire better reasons. So, legit, it depends on how you interpret legit. Pragmatically, it is, it's good enough. It's a good enough reason. Logically, it's not really legit because, of course, in Buddhism, there is no capital G God, at least not in Theravada Buddhism. So it all depends on how you look at it. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And Austin says, is there something independently real that grounds reality in the 5 skandhas, or is it all transient properties dependent and empty, turtles all the way down? Well, this is one of those liminal dealing with 2 different levels of reality. At the level of samsaric phenomenal reality, then no, there is not something independently real that grounds reality and the 5 khandhas. He uses skandhas, which is the Sanskrit version. It's all transient properties, dependent and empty, all like interrelated. So it's like every conditioned thing is conditioned by other conditioned things, and none of it really has an underlying self essence. But you can say all the way down at the bottom, like at the level of ultimate reality, like the bedrock of ultimate reality, then you have this ultimate reality, the uncarved block from which all these imaginary statues are carved in imagination. You got the uncarved block, but it just transcends phenomenal reality or unreality. It's just this paradoxical state that anything you say about it is going to be invalid. It's like essentially nirvana, the Dharmakaya, capital G God, the Tao, Brahman, whatever, like the quantum field. It's like whatever you want to call it. It's this underlying like bedrock of reality that is just off the scale. You can't really say that it exists or doesn't exist or anything like that, and trying to pin it down is just going to make you go nuts. because you can't do it. But at the level of phenomenal reality, then no, I mean, there is nothing that's independently real that grounds all of the phenomenal world, other than what is just off the scale. And it's just this paradoxical ultimate reality that has no constituent parts, no perceivable aspects. Nirguna Brahman, ultimate reality, which has no perceivable qualities. So I'm just going to move on to Austin's next question. And I'm aware that a lot of people just are not satisfied by such answers because they insist on ultimate reality expressed in words. And if you express it in words, it's not ultimate reality. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. And some people are just so addicted to their own thinking that they just cannot accept that. And so they just keep searching and searching and searching and searching in vain for some logical, coherent explanation of ultimate reality. And the best you can get would be like Madhyamaka philosophy or like the philosophy of Kant, where you can sort of get a grip on how delusion works that creates a false reality, but it really can't touch the ultimate reality below it or pervading it or whatever. So I'm just going to move on to Austin's second question, which is, I think you should find a Mahayana monk and get him on your show for some crosstalk. What do you think? Well, if any Mahayana monk wants to talk with me, that's fine. My woman is always on my case, or maybe I should say continually, not constantly, but continually on my case to like invite this person on my show or invite that person and that kind of thing. And for me, it just doesn't work that way. I'm just sort of like surfing the waves, and whatever comes my way, I'll surf it. Somebody invites me to do a talk, that's fine. So any Mahayana monks out there want to have a discussion, like on a YouTube video, then that's fine with me. If Austin here wants to hook me up with one, that'll work too. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, also from Austin. Austin's third question: do you believe your metapsychical beliefs aligned more with Mahayana, Madhyamaka than Theravada? I think maybe he means metaphysical and not metapsychical. So metaphysical beliefs, yeah, my metaphysics are definitely more Mahayanist than Theravadan, because Theravada, to some degree, they're like realists. They believe in 4 ultimate realities, which then can be divided out into, gosh, I don't even remember the total number, 80 something. But the 4 main ones: mind, matter, mental states, and nirvana. So they've got nirvana and like samsara at the same level of reality, which is already starting off on the wrong foot. But I do not consider physical matter to be ultimately real. So that kind of kicks me out of Theravadan orthodoxy right there. So yeah, Madhyamaka comes closer, but I'm saying my metaphysical beliefs are more in accordance with Mahayana. Mahayana is just lots of different schools. It's not just one school of Buddhism called Mahayana. It's a whole bunch of different schools, sort of like you might have one Roman Catholicism, but you've got all kinds of Protestant schools in Christianity. And Mahayana is sort of like Protestant Buddhism in a sense, in that the Baptists aren't necessarily on speaking terms with the Jehovah's Witnesses, who in turn don't have anything to do with the Mormons, who in turn maybe don't have anything to do with the Seventh-day Adventists, etc. There is no Pope of Protestantism because they do not consider each other to be authoritative. Mahayana is similar to this. So with regard to Madhyamaka, definitely. Yeah, my metaphysics is more Madhyamaka than Theravadan, I have to admit. And Madhyamaka says, it's all just, there is no underlying self-essence. Nothing is ultimately real that you can point at. Whereas in Theravada, Our bodies are made out of rupa kalapas. Our minds also are made of rupa kalapas, which are like these little atoms that are ultimately real. At least the constituent components are ultimately real, like the subatomic particles constituting these rupa kalapas are ultimately real, even though they're conditioned and exist for only a trillionth of an eye blink. But still, they're ultimately real, according to Theravada, and I really cannot accept that. So I'm more Madhyamaka, although some schools of Mahayana I have even less use for than some of the tenets of orthodox commentarial Theravada. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Kalabison. And Kalabison says, how do you think Buddhism can help someone with self-esteem problems to be more confident and outgoing? I've always had these problems, and although I've improved over the years, I still feel down a lot of the time, and I tend to be a people pleaser. So how can Buddhism help someone with self-esteem problems to be more confident and outgoing? Well, I mean, the main purpose of Buddhism isn't to turn you into an extrovert, to make you more outgoing. But, so I mean, there are no practices you're going to find in the suttas, here monks is how to become more outgoing. You're not going to find it. But indirectly, certain Buddhist practices can help you to be more confident and maybe more outgoing, even though, of course, Buddhism is much more inclined to endorse solitude and just being a hermit. So self-esteem, I mean, in Buddhism, there is no self. And so if you take that seriously, then you're going to be without much of an ego. At least your ego is going to be much reduced, along with these like ego doubting itself, self-esteem issues. If you don't have a self, you're not going to have self-esteem issues. So, I mean, you just learn to be more equanimous, just accept the way things are. To be more confident, I mean, saddha, or which usually translated as faith, sometimes is translated, especially by monk translators, as confidence. So if you have more faith in Dhamma, that's a certain kind of confidence. It's more confidence in Dhamma than confidence in yourself, though. But how to be more confident and outgoing? Just worry. I mean, it seems to me like the main problem here is like worry, anxiety, which is kukucha in Pali, and it is always bad karma. It's the same as regret or remorse, a guilty conscience, that kind of thing. It's all kukucha, and like feeling anxiety in public, feeling nervous before you give a public speech, for example, that would all be kukucha also. So, I mean, the more you practice mindfulness, I mean, mindfulness is the panacea. Mindfulness cures all ills. So if you observe self-consciousness arise, self-consciousness in the bad sense, or like anxiety, worry, anything like that, just social awkwardness, you observe that as a kind of phenomenon that isn't you, because it really isn't you. It's just this habitual mental state that arises, and so long as you keep feeding it, it's going to be like a stray dog. It's just not going to go away. But if you stop feeding it, it'll hang around for a while, but then it'll drift away. Any kind of bad habit, including social anxiety, for example, that just observe it, don't feed it, be mindful of it. That would be the best approach, I guess, from a Buddhist point of view. I mean, it might not make you more outgoing, because being outgoingness is not necessarily a Buddhist virtue. Anyways, towards the end, Kalabison says, I tend to be a people pleaser. And I mean, trying to help people be happy is one thing, but using like pleasing people as a kind of defense mechanism a survival mechanism, always trying to be on the good side of people. I mean, I've known people like this, especially like short, skinny, passive kind of guys that I have known that, they just kind of like, they're just really pleasant and joking a lot. And, they just kind of survive, sort of like the little dog that kind of wags its tail through life. And I don't know, it's like, if you're doing it for the sake of just trying to please people to make yourself more safe or something, then yeah, that's not necessarily a wholesome mental state or a wholesome attitude. But I mean, just being a people pleaser in the sense of just trying to help people be happy, trying to be pleasant rather than unpleasant. Like if you're in a bad mood, not taking it out on others, that kind of thing, that's 100% A-okay from a Buddhist point of view. But outgoingness really is not a Buddhist virtue. Not that it's necessarily bad. I mean, if you just feel perfectly comfortable in the midst of a crowd and just strike up conversations with people you don't know, I've never been that way. A lot of people are like that. Some of the people I work with, that's how I got to know them, is they just walk right up and start talking, because they just walk right up and start talking to everybody. But they're probably not role models for the perfect Buddhist in other respects. So, mindfulness is the panacea. Mindfulness cures all ills. And there are other, just practicing meditation and so forth, it can improve your wisdom, which will not necessarily make you less awkward in public, but it will at least make you not care so much if you are awkward in public. And I should move on to the next question, which is from Java Nandin. I don't know how to pronounce this name. I'm just guessing. And Java Nandin says, I know you are not a fan of Visuddhimagga, but what is your opinion on Pala Samapati and Nirodha Samapati mentioned there? Well, first of all, Samapati just means attainment, and Pala Samapati and Nirodha Samapati are two entirely different attainments that are not related. It's not like a pair. You've got Magga and Pala that are paired, but not Pala and Nirodha. It's like Nirodha Samapati is a very advanced, presumably meditative state that only an anagami or an arahant can attain. And it's essentially a kind of, you just go into a coma. It's the cessation of perception and feeling, which from the Orthodox Theravada point of view means, you're essentially comatose. And I do not see why that would be considered such an exalted state. You wouldn't even be aware of having attained it, because the awareness of having attained anything would be part of the perception and feeling. So, I'm skeptical that the Buddha taught Nirodha Samapati, that Nirodha Samapati is just one of these meditative states that's above fourth jhana, that ancient Indian philosophers, they're just not satisfied with just four jhanas. And so you've got the Abhidhammists inventing a fifth jhana, that's where you divide second jhana into two, or you've got like the formless jhanas get added on as a kind of annex to fourth jhana, because technically fourth jhana was as high as you can go. And then you've got Nirodha Samapati gets postulated. You've got like the signless concentration of mind. What is it? Animita Chitta Samadhi, that is mentioned in a few suttas, that it's like the Indian mind is always trying to one up the highest. It's like some people are saying this is the highest, and then some other group says nope, because we've come up with a higher one. And I think that Nirodha Samapati may be one of those kind of things. And almost nobody would attain it anyway, because you'd have to be at least an anagami to attain it. Pala Samapati, on the other hand, is paired with Magga, and this also is kind of a weird, like practically a glitch in Orthodox Theravada Buddhist philosophy, that there's the four stages of sainthood, those of you who have watched these Q&As know my opinion about the 4 stages of sainthood. I think that in itself is a kind of artifact of later developments in Buddhism. But each of these 4 stages has 2 aspects to it. It's got mega and pala. Mega is the path. So you've entered the path on becoming a sotapanna or an anagami or whatever. And then there's the pala, or the fruition. So it's like, once you're like locked into becoming a sotapanna, then that's the path of the sotapanna mega. And then once you fully attain the consummation of sotapanna hood, then that's the pala, or the fruition. And so that would be the attainment of fruition, would be pala samapati. But it's in the suttas, it's talking about how both of these, like the 4 pairs of individuals who are worthy of respect, worthy of gifts, worthy of, bowing down to them and so forth. According to Orthodox Theravada, this mega stage lasts like a trillionth of an eye blink. It's just boop. So how are you going to bow down to somebody who exists for a trillionth of a second? So apparently there's a misunderstanding in Orthodox Theravada of what may have been in and of itself a previous misunderstanding, which furthermore may have been a garbling of like an earlier teaching, where you've got mega and pala, path and fruition, that supposedly the path stage lasted a considerable amount of time. That long enough period of time that you could bow to the person, offer them gifts and so forth. And it's not just a trillionth of a second, and then immediately you move on to pala. It's like one moment is path. It lasts only one moment, and then you hit pala afterwards. It's just kind of strange. So that's my opinion on that. And I'm heartily skeptical of both pala samapati and nirodha samapati, unless pala samapati refers only to like arahant stage, full enlightenment. But even I'm kind of skeptical about full enlightenment within the context of samsara, because within the context of samsara, everything is unenlightened, because samsara is an artifact of unenlightenment, ignorance, delusion. So I better just move on to the next question here. See, we've been going for almost an hour and a half. You guys have the luxury of just looking down at the time bar and seeing how long this is going to be. I don't even know. So the next question is from Jules. And Jules says, is it possible to make Marco Elise a Supreme Court justice? And when he asked this question, I didn't even know who Marco Elise is. I don't know how to pronounce Elise. It could be Elise for all I know. Marco is pretty solid. I got Marco down, but the second name, the Elise, I don't know. And I didn't know who Marco was until just like half an hour later. I'm just like scanning news headlines, because the news is so fascinating nowadays, now that Trump is running amok in disassembling the deep state, reducing the size of government. And it turns out that Marco Elise, or whatever his name is he goes by the nickname of Big Balls. And he's one of the young autists that Elon Musk has appointed to review all these workers at USAID and determine whether they should keep their job or not. And there was some journalist, so-called, who had previously worked for USAID, who put out a hit piece against this Marco guy, and which caused him to resign because he had made racist comments on social media at some time in the past. And then finally, cooler heads prevailed, and he was brought back in, and he's now back on the audit squad of deciding the future of people who work at USAID. And anyways, Jules says, is it possible to make him a Supreme Court justice? Technically, I almost called Trump the Buddha. Oh, that's not good. Anyways, technically, Trump could nominate this Marco, this big balls, as a Supreme Court justice. But it's my understanding that a Supreme Court justice has to be approved by the Senate. I'm pretty sure. There's going to be like congressional hearings and so forth, and it's like the nominee has to appear. It was like what was his name, Kavanaugh. He had to get grilled by hysterical Democrats before he got to assume his seat on the Supreme Court. Also, the Natanji Brown Jackson, or whatever her name is, she's having to get grilled by Republicans asking her if she knows what a woman is, and she said, "I'm not a biologist. How should I know what a woman is?" So Trump could nominate Marco as a Supreme Court justice, but I doubt that he would get through I doubt that he would be approved by the Senate. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Master Poe, and Master Poe says, "Are you getting tired of these Q&As?" Not really. I mean, they're kind of getting longer. They're occupying a little bit more of my time, but the time that I'm using to do these Q&As used to be the time that I would use to write a blog post. And those of you who are familiar with my blog may have noticed that I haven't added a blog post to my blog in probably more than a year, because I'm doing this instead now. This is my means of promulgating the Dhamma rather than writing cynical blog posts. So am I getting tired of these Q&As? I mean, sometimes I'm tired and do them anyway. Not so much tired of the Q&A, but just tired in general, kind of a thing. But the show must go on. In a way, it's a public service that I'm happy to do. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the Three Holy Baskets. And the Three Holy Baskets say, because there's three of them, what are the types of women? I might have made a joke at the expense of the Tipitaka just now, and so I would like to retract that joke, because you shouldn't make jokes about Buddha, Dhamma, or Sangha. So the Three Holy Baskets says, or say, what are the types of women that the Buddha said we can have sex with or not possible to engage in sex with? I remember the Buddha said it somewhere. Yeah, it's with regard to kamesu michachara, sensual misconduct. And it's kind of strange that at least in one text, this kamesu michachara, or sensual misconduct, which is the third precept for someone taking 8 precepts. No, 5 precepts, even 5 precepts. So it's in the form of a list of the women that are forbidden. And it's patriarchal, it just assumes that it's guys. It's phallocentric, if you will. And just assumes that, it's going to be a man who is inquiring into this question. And every woman on the list that is forbidden is a woman who is already spoken for, under the protection or guidance or guardianship or ownership of somebody else. Like a woman who's already married. I mean, she's under the authority of her husband. He's got authority over her. Another man shouldn't mess with a married woman. You've got a woman who's betrothed. She's engaged, already spoken for. You've got a woman still living with her parents. You've got the slave girl of another person. You've got a female inmate in a prison who's under the guardianship or protection of the prison staff, the prison guards. And there's a few other ones. There's one or two obscure ones that really just kind of fit into ancient Indian culture. But the gist of it is that any woman who is already under the protection or guardianship of another person is off limits. So technically, even if you're a young guy, a young woman who is still living with her parents, she'd be off limits, so to speak. If she moved out, then it'd be different. And so, you don't really have to be married. It's the third precept isn't just don't commit adultery, because you can still be monogamous without technically being married. I mean, marriage just is not a Theravada Buddhist institution anyway. That's purely a secular affair. Monks, it is strictly forbidden for a monk to conduct a wedding ceremony. Like in Burma, it's like you just, when a man and a woman get married, in general, they just go down to the village headman and sign papers, they're married. And then after that, the couple will go to the monastery and then the monks will bless a done deed. So, I mean, you don't necessarily have to be married to the person, but generally, promiscuous sex is out. So like a prostitute, you know, she's under the authority of her pimp or whatever. And mainly what it means is it's somebody that you are monogamous with, that neither one of you is like under obligations to anyone else. And that is acceptable. It's not necessarily recommended because, of course, celibacy is considered to be best from an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view. But there we are. I think I answered that question. And so I'm just going to move on to the Three Holy Baskets' second question, which is Niyata Mithya Drushti is homosexuality, right? I got no idea. It's a Sanskrit term. It's not found in Theravada Buddhism, and because Theravada Buddhism doesn't deal with Sanskrit, it's Pali. I'm not exactly sure what the Pali version. Niyata would be the same, but Mithya Drushti. Maybe Drushti would be like corruption. It'd be like duty in Pali. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I don't know enough about this to really answer it, because I mean, it's my understanding that like in ancient India, like in the Buddhist time, they really didn't have much of a concept of homosexuality, kind of like in ancient Rome. Like there wasn't really a concept of homosexuality in ancient Rome. It's just like if you were on top, I mean, you could be like underneath could be a woman or like a teenage boy or whatever, but if you were on top, then you were still acting the role of a man. You were still masculine. That was, you know, that's as far as it went. And I think in ancient India, men with what would be called homosexual tendencies now would choose like eunuchs, that kind of thing. I mean, I'm sure there must have been homosexuality, like two gay men together in ancient India, even though they may not have had a word for it. But, you know, it's just, I'm not aware of it being specifically addressed in Pali texts. And Niyata Mithya Drushti, maybe if it's not Mahayana, it's a Hindu term, and I'm not familiar with it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Trzaskazis, who now goes by the name of Julie. And Trzaskazis, who now goes by the name of Julie, says, if beings in heaven realms cannot hear or see us, then what about Mara, who can? You've mentioned that the Buddha didn't teach Dhamma to his previous two teachers because they were in heaven realm. It wasn't just that they were in a heaven realm, they were in a formless realm where they had no sense organs. And so he couldn't teach the Deva or the Brahmas in a formless heaven realm because they had no body, and because they were just pure mind with no body. They didn't have ears to hear, they didn't have eyes to see. Why the Buddha couldn't have communicated telepathically with them, I don't know. But that was like the reason that the Buddha, after he became enlightened, he didn't teach his first two teachers who taught him jhana, because they were in formless realms. They mastered these formless jhanas. They died in formless jhana. They entered this formless realm, and so he couldn't teach them. But ordinary like devas and also the Brahmas from the Rupa Loka, or the realm of form, the Brahmas that still have a physical body, they can see us if they want to. Most of them don't want to see us. You know, it's sort of like, why would we want to go to some vacant lot and look at the ants crawling around in this vacant lot? I mean, most of us, unless we're entomologists or little kids who are interested in ants, we just don't care. And so, like, devas and Brahmas can see us. we can't necessarily see them. It's like whoever's the higher can generally see the lower beings, but the lower beings can't necessarily see the higher beings unless maybe the higher beings like adjust their vibration or something to make themselves visible to us. How that relates to ghosts is kind of problematic because ghosts are lower. Generally, we can't see them. And it's my understanding that ghosts in general can't see us either. So it may be that ghosts that we see, that when a person does see a ghost, I mean, the ghost doesn't necessarily see us back because we are at the less crude level of matter than they are. So let's see. If beings in heaven realms cannot see or hear us, yeah, well, some of them can, all except for the ones in the formless realms, because the ones in the formless realms don't have eyes or ears. So yeah, Mara, I mean, he's in the highest Deva realm. There's Brahma realms above Mara. Let's see. You mentioned the Buddha didn't teach Dhamma to his previous two teachers because they were in heaven realms. Yeah, they were in formless heaven realms. So I think I answered that question from Trzaskaz's alias Julie. And so Trzaskaz's alias Julie's second question is, do you prefer apples or oranges? I prefer oranges. If I'm just going to eat the fruit, I eat lots of oranges. I rarely eat an apple. Almost never. In fact, ever since I was a kid, I have disliked apple peel. It's like eating sour wax paper wrapped around the apple. With regard to cooked apples, like in pies or apple fritters or something, I'm all for it. Apple fritters, my favorite pastry is probably an apple fritter. But just the fruit itself, I prefer oranges. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cleefy. Cleefy says, if all of us in this realm are crazy, but some of us are aware that we are crazy, does it make those who are aware of the craziness less crazy? And yes, indeed it does. And I do not have my copy of the Dhammapada handy. I think it's verse 63. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure, almost pretty sure that verse 63 of the Dhammapada says, the fool who is aware of his foolishness is at least wise to that extent. But the fool who considers himself wise is called a fool indeed. And that was one of my great comforting thoughts as a young monk. It's like, if I know that I'm a fool, at least I'm wise to that extent. That in itself is a kind of wisdom. So, let's see here. Let's go back to the question here. If all of us in this realm are crazy, but some of us are aware that we are crazy, does it make those who are aware of the craziness? Yeah, it does. If you're aware of your foolishness, then you're at least wise to that extent. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mooners. Mooners says, what do you think of J.D. Vance's concept of ordo amoris? Does Buddhist lay ethics support ordo amoris? And I don't know what was in my mind at the time, but when Mooners mentioned J.D. Vance, I was thinking Jack Vance, who was an old science fiction writer from like back in the 1960s. And I'm thinking it must be from some science fiction novel or something. But actually, J.D. Vance is the vice president of the United States. And he was talking about ordo amoris in a recent interview. And ordo amoris is like ordered love. It's like with regard to loving others, there's like a priority list. You know, like presumably for a Christian, God would be at the top of the list. You love God, then you like love yourself, you love your family, you love your neighbors, you love people that are like sinning against you and so forth. It'd be like this priority list of who you're supposed to love, maybe who you should love more. And does Buddhist lay ethics support that? I assume it does. I mean, ideally, like a fully enlightened being would just love everyone the same, but at the same time realizing that nobody really exists. But for a layperson, I think it would not be at all in conflict with Buddhist lay ethics that you would love your wife and your children more than you love the person who is bad-mouthing you in public. It's just like practical common sense. You know, you self-love, love of your immediate family, love of your friends. I mean, if you can manage it, you love your enemies too. I mean, that's not some monopoly of Christianity, that a Buddhist should love his enemies also. But it's more important, I think, for you to love your spouse and your children and yourself. I mean, that would be more vital, more important in living a happy life than, you know, loving Adam Schiff, let's say. And those of you who don't know who Adam Schiff is, well, good for you. So I would assume that it's like tacitly allowed in Buddhism. Maybe there's even texts, you know, with regard to lay ethics, you know, giving some kind of priority. You know, you should have respect for your teachers and that kind of thing. Yeah, I don't think that it would violate just secular lay Buddhist ethics, that you have like a priority list of who gets the most love and who gets like the leftovers. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Thermal Squid. And Thermal Squid asked some questions in the previous Q&A about, you know, why should you believe in Nibbana if it can't be logically proven, kind of stuff. And I answered the question. You can look at the previous Q&A if you want to see what my answers were. Excuse me. I'm trying to burp and not burp at the same time. So anyway, Thermal Squid says, I wouldn't say I'm obsessed with intellect, but the absurdities seem to begin when we abandon it outright. In simpler terms, samsara encompasses all conditionality and also all mental states. There are then no metaphysical tools and mediums we can use here to help us. Perception is out, discrimination is out, tradition, ritual, etc. Everything is gone here. Wherein then is knowledge or immersion of Nibbana or the deathless actually found? The best you're going to get is mysticism. You know, like St. John of the Cross, he talks about dark faith, where in his version of contemplation, you just dismiss everything from your mind that is not God. Buddhist point of view, dismiss everything from your mind that is not Nibbana. And few people can do this. Disclaimer here, few people can actually manage this. But getting back to St. John of the Cross, you can't see God through your senses. You can't sense God through your senses. Dismiss the senses. You can't understand God intellectually. Dismiss the intellect. You can't understand God emotionally. Dismiss the emotions. You can't know God through any like mental state. Dismiss all the mental states. And so you get down to just what should be just emptiness and nothing. But according to St. John of the Cross, you still know something is there. And that is just like the Spirit of God that pervades the universe. You're somehow still aware of that. You know that it's there. That's dark faith, because, I mean, it's dark because there's no real conceptual content to it. You've already dismissed the concepts. It's just like an immediate awareness. And people have more or less talent at this kind of awareness, where you just call it intuitive. You know, it's maybe deeper than what would be standard intuition, but there's like this feeling, like when I was a kid, you know, like a teenager, I'm reading my first like Eastern philosophy books, and it's saying, you know, it's all an illusion. This world is an illusion. And somehow deep down, I'm like, yeah, I really got on board with that. But at the time, I didn't even understand, like, philosophically why it was saying this. It was just like deep down, there was just this feeling of, yes, that's it. And you can be mistaken with regard to this kind of stuff too. I mean, some people are just absolutely sure that this or that cult leader is fully enlightened when really they aren't. But that's part of the problem. I mean, it's like we are delusional, And we're trying to use our own deluded mind to cure ourselves of delusion. So, I mean, you're just going to have a certain amount of faith at first. Choose the wisest faith you can come up with, and then go with that. Let's see here. It's like, at the beginning here, he says, I wouldn't say I'm obsessed with intellect, but the absurdities seem to begin when we abandon it outright. No, that's not true at all, because absurdity is itself just a figment of intellect. I mean, you get rid of the intellect, you get rid of the absurdities also. If you're in a state of just like mystical contemplation, where there's no intellect, there's no absurdity either. It's just, I mean, absurdities can come through various means, humor or paradox, or just like sloppy intellect. But it's still intellect. I mean, it's insisting upon rigorous logic. I mean, you're just locking yourself into a cage. And that's not going to get you enlightened either. So to some degree, you've got to have a certain amount of faith. And that's like in the Pali text, it talks about the 5 strengths or the 5 faculties. And 2 of them are faith and essentially intellect, or it's like faith and like, what would be a good word? I mean, in the Pali word is panya, but it doesn't necessarily mean wisdom here. It's more like theory. You know, you've got faith or just intellect. Let's just go with intellect. Faith or intelligence. And they have to be in balance. You have too much faith and not enough intelligence, then you can believe anything no matter how ridiculous it is. But if you have too much intelligence, not enough faith, then you're going to be so skeptical. I mean, you're not going to do anything. You'll have insufficient data to really do anything. And according to the Visuddhimagga, take that for what it's worth, a person with too much intelligence and not enough faith is like a person who is sick, and their sickness is caused by the medicine that they're taking. You know, you just keep taking the medicine, which just keeps you sick. So at the bottom here is the actual question mark. Wherein then is knowledge or immersion of Nibbana or the deathless actually found? I mean, ultimately it's mysticism. And a lot of people, including a lot of brilliant intellectuals, have almost no mystical talent whatsoever. They just do not get it. Like Stephen Hawking was saying, mysticism clouds the issues, when actually it's the issues that cloud mysticism. So I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's next question here, which is, it is said, at least in some of these videos, that Nibbana can't be experienced, so it seems to me that we are still using logic or reason and or discursive thinking here. It seems to me that intuition that there is an ultimate and perfect reality is not deniable. The technicalities are what I'm focused on. Endless deliberation on truth or words here is not the issue, but actually making something like enlightenment or even absorption reachable, not just an artifact of one's intent or efforts, something actually substantial beyond a kind of contentless consciousness, which might be too quickly discerned to be the absolute itself, e.g. Brahman, the one, and so on and so forth. Take the metaphor of the raft. Do you sail out across the river with a busted raft that will sink? It seems to me that we'd be double, triple, quadruple checking this to absolutely make sure that we don't drown. Well, this isn't really a question. It's just something that I just decided I'd comment on, that you make the raft, you're not just going to be like in over-analysis paralysis on the near shore, doubting whether the raft is really going to get you across. I mean, you make the raft as best you can, and then you just go out there and brave it. And it takes a certain amount of faith that you're going to be able to do it. And that maybe it's going to take a certain amount of faith that there is even another shore on the other side, because you can't necessarily see it. Let's say maybe it's really foggy that day. So that was just sort of my 2 cents worth on that one. So Thermal Squid's real second question here is, can critters become enlightened? And that depends on who you talk to. According to Eckhart Tolle, in his first famous book, The Power of Now, all animals are already enlightened in a sense, because they're fully in the present moment. They're not living in the future, not living in the past. And the only animals that are not enlightened are animals that have acquired certain neurotic tendencies from their owners, like domesticated animals like dogs. Although from the Buddhist point of view, animals are not enlightened. So can critters become enlightened? Technically, from an orthodox point of view, just giving the official orthodox answer here, no, animals cannot become fully enlightened. Regardless of Eckhart Tolle saying that most of them already are enlightened. Because, how much greed, hate, and delusion does a microscopic copepod, like plankton in the ocean, or a jellyfish, how much greed, hate, and delusion does a jellyfish have? Possibly zero. But it also has no real mind at that point. So I think that an animal like a cow might be closer to enlightenment than the average human, but that's just because they have less mind, which can hold less delusion. So really, it's a matter of, in the cow's case, going with Buddhist philosophy, that it's going to have to keep moving forwards and get more and more deluded before it can get to the point where it's conscious enough that it can start reversing that delusion. And something like an insect, I think insects are just kind of like little terminators, like little robots. They might have consciousness, but I doubt that they have perceptions. And perception is where delusion comes in. So, it may be that they're already kind of enlightenment. It's kind of a bummer to think that a fly or a mosquito is an enlightened being, but in a way they kind of are, because they just don't have greed, hate, and delusion. They're just little robots, this little glimmer, this little speck of consciousness. But I think I'll just move on to the third question, because it's a follow-up of the second question. He says, if so, what creatures do you think are closer to enlightenment or liberation than others? Well, there's two different closer to enlightenment. Like I already mentioned, a cow is probably closer to enlightenment with regard to it has less greed, hate, and delusion than the average human. But it's going to have to keep progressing forwards. It can't back up and just have less and less till it has zero. It's going to have to get more and more greed, hate, and delusion by becoming a more complex creature that becomes self-referential and can actually start trying to reprogram itself. So the animals that are closer to liberation than others would probably be the most intelligent ones, the ones that have the most consciousness about them, which, like sperm whales, dolphins, elephants, apes, the creatures that are considered to be, highly intelligent would probably be closer chronologically, temporally to enlightenment than other animals like a cow, even though the cow may have less greed, hate, and delusion. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. PSA says, are you a Naga that only takes human form during online videos? Don't lie, don't break Sila. Are you a Naga? And apparently from the context, he's referring to shape-shifting cobra dragons. And yeah, I'm not a shape-shifting cobra dragon. I promise I'm not a shape-shifting cobra dragon. There are other interpretations of Naga. Sometimes the Buddha is called a Naga, but he's not called a shape-shifting cobra dragon. That Naga is apparently not an Indo-European term, and it refers to any kind of imposing being. So an elephant, like a bull elephant, can be called a Naga. The Buddha can be called Naga. And if somebody considers me to be imposing, then arguably maybe I could be that kind of Naga, but I am not a cobra dragon. I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Alfred, who I believe asked this question on Rumble. It's rare to get a question for a Q&A on Rumble. Usually on Rumble, all I get are these people giving me facile praise of how great my content is and then offering to optimize my presence for a small fee. That's almost the only kind of comments I get on Rumble. So anyways, Alfred says, does the persona transfer at rebirth? And I'm not exactly sure what Alfred is referring to with regard to the persona. Although I would mention, in the previous Q&A, I was discussing like really hard to understand movies. Persona by Ingmar Bergman. That's a difficult to understand movie. When you get to the end of the movie, it's like, all of a sudden it ends. It's like, why did it end? I mean, I didn't even have a grip on what was going on yet. So anyways, Alfred is saying, does the persona transfer at rebirth? And I looked in the dictionary because I wasn't sure what he meant by persona. And it turns out that there are various interpretations, various possible definitions of the term. And the two main ones that I think he might be referring to is, one is the aspect of someone's character that is presented to or perceived by others. Or it could be, in accordance with Jungian psychology, the outer or assumed aspect of a character. So I guess it'd be like your personality, especially the outward aspects of your personality, the obvious to others aspects of your personality. Does that transfer at rebirth? To some degree, but it's not going to be necessarily, just the exact same mannerisms and so forth. Because you're going to have possibly be reborn into a different culture. You're going to have some different DNA. It's all going to be kind of added to the mix, and it's not going to be exactly the same. I mean, it could be enough that some intuitive, maybe psychically gifted person could recognize you as, their Aunt Mabel or whatever. But it's more complicated than that. It's like your karma is all that really transfers. And that can manifest to some degree as your persona, but also influencing your persona is going to be a lot of other factors, like karma from the life you just came into, that is starting to take place immediately, like cultural conditioning and that sort of thing. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, and we've been going at it for 2 hours. Golly, this is kind of a scary one. Not this question, but just the mass of questions I have received. We may have to trim it down to no more than 2 questions per episode. So anyways, this is from Quasitor, and Quasitor says, do you think it's possible that time is an illusion, and those of us, if not all, who are destined to be arahants are getting guidance from our arahant future selves who reside in Parinibbana? Nobody's residing in Parinibbana. Parinibbana is undifferentiated. It's unconditioned. I mean, it's just Nibbana. Parinibbana technically is like the death of an enlightened being. So they're like crossing over into Nibbana. That's Parinibbana. It's like Parinibbana is Nibbana without residue, which means you don't have an enlightened being's body and mind still kind of associated. It's just Parinibbana is, you've passed away and you don't come back. And there's no discernible content in Nibbana. It's without moving parts. So there's nobody residing in Nibbana or Parinibbana. But getting back to the first part of the question is, do you think it's possible that time is an illusion? Yeah, I do think that time is an illusion. And those of us, especially like the passage of time, and those of us, if not all, who are destined to be arahants are getting guidance from our arahant future selves. It's not necessarily your arahant future selves. I mean, it could just be your more advanced, wiser future selves, or kind of like you still are kind of connected to them because of the illusion of the passage of time. It's like your future selves already exist in a sense, and they're still you. They're sort of connected to you. And I've had this idea when I was a monk. It's like, who would I pray to in a moment of desperation? It's like the gods and enlightened beings out there, plus also like the future me who is much more advanced. I mean, not the future me who's fully enlightened and just dead and gone. I mean, what's the point of praying to that person? But, before you become fully enlightened and die going to Nibbana, you might have psychic powers and so forth that you could beam meta back at your previous suffering deluded incarnations, so to speak. So I think that's possible. And I do think that you could derive benefit from the wisdom and goodness of future incarnations, so to speak, of you. You get to the point where you're close to Nibbana, you got psychic powers, you just got these oceans of love you can beam. You beam them back at this miserable, fucked up previous version of you. That kind of thing. That's possible. I don't think it's necessarily orthodox Theravada, but I do think that it's possible. And so I'm going to move on to Quasitor's next question, which is, if a meditator experiences jhana every day for the last 3 years of their life and then dies in agony, incapable of jhana at time of death, versus someone who has never experienced jhana and then achieves it on their deathbed and dies in jhana, does the meditator, first person, not get reborn in a jhana realm, but the second person does? Technically, according to Orthodox Theravada, yes. So that's why Gaudika self-terminated in the mind-blowing Gaudika Sutta, where Gaudika, he got jhana and lost it, and then got jhana and lost it, and got jhana and lost it. And it's like his mind was kind of unstable with regard to that. My mind was similar. I could really relate to that. Where, you get into deep meditation and then you just kind of lose it, and then you get into deep meditation and then just lose it. And Gaudika was like this. He was getting jhana and then losing it, getting it, losing it, getting it, losing it, until finally he was getting desperate. And he's thinking, if I die without jhana, then, there's no guarantees of anything. He could wind up in a hell realm or something. But if he dies while he's got jhana, he's guaranteed of a Brahma realm. So the next time he got it, he auto-terminated. He took his head shaving razor and did an icky thing to his own neck. And so, and not only did he not get a lower realm, but he became enlightened as he was bleeding out, and his consciousness became unmanifest. So technically, according to Orthodox Theravada Buddhist philosophy, the second person does better than the first person. First person had jhana for 3 years and then died without it. Sorry, no Brahma realm for you. Whereas the second person, he gets jhana for the first time in his life, dies immediately, boom, Brahma realm. So there you go. And I'm just going to move on to Quasitor's third question. Does wishing good wishes and prayer for someone to get well actually help them heal? And can someone's negative wishes upon you cause you to become ill mentally or physically? Or is it more of a placebo effect and not the energy itself? I'm not sure that there's necessarily even a difference between like somebody's blessings curing you and the placebo effect. Like when Jesus in the New Testament would heal somebody, and they would thank him, and he would say, it's your own faith that cured you. So if you don't have faith, then in a way it hinders deriving the benefit or the opposite of benefit from somebody else, like beaming mental states at you. Although with saints, with saintly people, all things are possible, it seems like, or a lot of things are possible that aren't possible for normies. So I do think that like prayer, the prayer of a righteous man availeth much. Good wishes, just like beaming metta, which would be more of a Theravada Buddhist way of going about it, that it can help people. Or beaming hate at somebody could harm people. But the other person's karma is really key. That if they just don't have the karma for you to succeed, then you're not going to succeed. sometimes you can try to help someone even physically and it just backfires. I mean, I remember back when I was a young man, I wouldn't kill insects or spiders that were in my apartment. You know, I'd catch them with a cup and a piece of cardboard and let them go outside. And I remember I caught something. I don't remember what it was. Some kind of little creepy crawly. I let it go out on the front porch, and it immediately just comes heading straight back at me. And then a spider jumps out and grabs it. You know, it's like you try to help it, and it just made it worse. Or one time, I was a college student, and I was at some alpine lake, and I'm sitting by the side of this lake up in the mountains, and this little ant just comes trundling down the rocks and just goes right out into the water and starts floundering. So I scoop the ant out and put it on the rock, you know, let it dry out, and immediately it just heads straight out into the water again. So you catch it one more time, put it up on the rock, immediately it was just determined to like auto terminate, I guess. So finally the third time I just said, well, your call. I wash my hands of this one. So, I mean, it depends a lot on the karma of the individual involved. Like even Jesus of Nazareth, you know, he had these miraculous healing abilities. You know, he was psychic powers, would be called in Buddhism, but someone who just thought he was, you know, who's this guy think he is? You know, this is just Jesus, the carpenter's son. That somebody like that, Jesus wouldn't be able to heal them. You know, he went to his own hometown of Nazareth, and everyone there is like, who does he think he is? That's just Jesus, the carpenter's son. And Jesus wasn't able to do very many miracles there. He just cast out a few demons and then left, saying, no prophet is without honor except in his own hometown. So, I mean, if you have the karma that makes you receptive to that, then somebody blessing you can heal you just as some doctor giving you medicine can heal you. But you got to have the karma for it. And I'm just going to move on to the next question because we've been going at it for more than 2 hours, and I'm not exactly sure how many more questions there are, but there's at least several. And so, next question is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, if you were given the choice, in which realm of existence would you like to take rebirth and why? Well, let's say not taking rebirth isn't an option here. It's like you got to take rebirth, but at least you get to pick where you're going to be reborn. And probably I'd be better off just not picking where my karma just puts me where I need to be. I mean, that would be the wise choice. You start like making conscious decisions. It might not serve you nearly as well as if you just let karma take its course. Sort of like, you know, it's like people in ancient times, they would be making offerings to Aphrodite because they want such and such person to love them. You know, they want to hook up with this person when really they'd be better off not forcing the issue and just letting the person who is destined to be their mate show up maybe a year down the road. It may be that trying to force the issue can just land you in the wrong place with the wrong person. And I've got this little pop-up window I gotta get rid of. Okay, so getting back to the question though, see, I'm meandering all over the place, even with the most questions ever in a Q&A video. I'm still just meandering and digressing, just AF. So Dhamma River says, if you were given the choice, in which realm of existence would you like to take rebirth and why? Well, I mean, you could kind of cheat and go for the pure abodes because you're guaranteed nirvana once you have passed away from the pure abodes. Only anagamis can go there. So, I mean, I could kind of cheat and like go to the pure abodes, which would then necessitate me being an anagami. Or if that kind of cheating is frowned upon, then I don't know, tawatimsa would be nice. You know, it's sort of like being just this wealthy, powerful, beautiful human who never gets sick. You know, you can just kind of manipulate your reality to some degree. You know, you want chocolate ice cream, you just automatically get it. That kind of thing. Tawatimsa wouldn't be bad. Plus, you get to meet all the most famous gods are in Tawatimsa. So, yeah, I think I might do that if the pure abodes were off limits for whatever reason. You know, so even genies, when they give you 3 wishes, you know, you find the lamp on the beach, you rub the lamp, the genie comes out, offers you 3 wishes. Sometimes there's still limitations. It's like, you know, you can't wish for like one of your wishes to be like 3 more wishes. It's just cheating and you can't do it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Wayne. And Wayne says, in your view, how far could a householder go on the path to enlightenment? Well, even a householder can become enlightened. It's just that you've got more of the cards stacked against you. It's much more difficult. It's a much higher difficulty setting. But some householders do become enlightened, I'm pretty sure. It's just that, let's say, for example, I've brought this up before. Let's say that a monk or a nun is 1,000 times more likely to become enlightened than a layperson. But there are 10,000 times more lay people than monks and nuns. So still you'd have 10 times more enlightened lay people than enlightened monks and nuns. Just going with the math. So, I mean, technically you could make it the whole way, although the way it generally works for lay people, if they get into some higher awakening, you know, somebody like Eckhart Tolle, or I always forget his name, John Wren Lewis, somebody like that, it's usually by accident. It's like they go into this crisis and just get slammed out of their unenlightened rut. So a householder who becomes enlightened, it seems to me they're much more likely to be like hit in the head by something than to do it through meditative insight. That's just my experience. Just Westerners in general who become enlightened, or who appear to become enlightened, who have some kind of awakening experience, as a general rule, because Westerners are so lukewarm, so inclined to overthink everything, that generally they just lack the faith, for one thing, to really just go wholeheartedly like a medieval Catholic saint and become enlightened through just, you know, intense practice. That instead they're just kind of ripe, and then they get beat over the head or have some kind of near-death experience, or like in Eckhart Tolle's case, just this existential crisis where it's just so unbearable that it just like wrenches them out of their rut, and they wind up in this higher level of consciousness. That it's something that you don't plan for. It's just, you just get visited by this crisis and you have enlightenment thrust upon you. So anyways, I'm going to move on to Wayne's second question, which is, could you describe the destination of a non-returner? And I just mentioned that it's the pure abodes, that non-returners, or anagamis, after they die, they go into these high heaven realms that are accessible only to anagamis, only to good Buddhists. Only good Buddhists get to go to these heaven realms. And they are guaranteed that when they pass away from that heaven realm, that pure abode, they just fade into enlightenment, fade into nirvana. Nibbana, I should say. So, yeah, I think there's four heaven realms called the pure abodes, and all anagamis go to them. And I think you still have a body, maybe. Yeah, I think it's like the highest Brahma realms. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Thought Fog. And I'm going to cheat a little and scroll. And yeah, we got several questions, but it's not a very long scroll to the bottom at this point. So the next question is from Thought Fog. And Thought Fog says, what's in your archive, digital and physical? Would you please do like a literature tour or something? Maybe your top 5 digital items and top 5 physical items in your possession. Yeah, I mean, it'd probably be better to do like a separate video that I prepare in advance with visual aids, like the actual books and so forth. The thing is, I mean, it's pretty much all past tense because I do very little reading nowadays. I mean, if I read, it's like online. I'll be reading like articles and so forth. I haven't read an actual book in more than a year. So my archive, I mean, I can just kind of roughly go over what's on my bookcase. That the top shelf of the bookcase is all Buddhist stuff. It starts off with Pali, like canonical texts, gets into Pali commentaries and dictionaries and grammars, that kind of thing. And then it gets just into like Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist history. And then towards the end, I've got some Zen stuff, which is still Buddhism. So it's on the top shelf. Then the second shelf, it starts off with other religions, Hinduism, Christianity, you know, the writings of St. John of the Cross are on the second shelf. You know, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, Miracle of Love, stories about Neem Karoli Baba. That's on the second shelf. No disrespect to Maharaji intended. And then it gets into some like paranormal, like parapsychology and a little bit of philosophy stuff towards the end. Then the third shelf is Western philosophy and let's see. Yeah, it's the third shelf is mostly like Western philosophy, including F.H. Bradley's Logic, which I'll possibly never read in my life because I just don't have the attention span living here in a house with internet that I did living in a cave with no internet and just a limited number of books to read. So you read everything you've got, no matter how dry and dull and complicated and difficult to read it is. Then towards the third, the second from the bottom is I've got history, like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Highly recommended. It's really a tragic story, though. I mean, reading about the gradual decline and eventual collapse of the Roman Empire, it really is tragic. It's just kind of sad. And let's see. Oh, I've got my strategy book down there. And some of my sweetheart's books about, let's see, like pre-Columbian America, that kind of thing. And then at the bottom is like fiction and poetry, that kind of stuff. That's on the bottom shelf. And my favorite stuff, well, let's see. Top shelf, I mean, I really like my two Zen classics book, which is the Mumon Kan and the Heikigan Roku. Even though it's not Theravada. Sutta Nipata, of course. My annotated Pali English dictionary, which is the big book with the blue cover that's all torn, showing the red binding underneath. I spent hundreds of hours annotating, like adding Pali words and adding definitions to the Pali words in there, so that every single page has just got pencil all in the margins of stuff that I added back when I was a monk. And let's see. I mean, some of the most important books I've ever read are actually on that shelf. Battle for the Mind by William Sargent. I don't see it. It's probably, let's see. Yeah, it's on there somewhere. And let's see. Golly. Miracle of Love, stories about Neem Karoli Baba, which is on the second shelf, really is one of my favorite books of all time. It's just an amazing book. It's about the closest book you can read to actually being in the presence of an enlightened being, or at least an extremely, extraordinarily, highly advanced one. And let's see. Moby Dick down on the bottom. The Idiot, Dostoevsky's The Idiot, which is probably my favorite novel I've got down there. And let's see what else. I guess that's good for my bookcase. And with regard to digital books, I mean, I've got the Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, which is one of my, I consider that to be like modern American scripture. That could be like a holy book or something, as far as I'm concerned. And like Charles Murray's Human Accomplishment, I think that's what it's called. That was really an important book for me to read. It's Charles Murray. I mean, he's more famous for co-writing The Bell Curve, but he wrote this book, in which he goes with like encyclopedias from all over the world, not just like in the English language, but like Japanese encyclopedias from like Arabic speaking countries, just all over the place. And like the biographical entries that have the most to say about them, the longest biographical entries, he would all calculate this in to who were the most significant people in history with regard to a number of things like art, music, science, technology, just these different fields. And so he compiles this list of the most important, influential people in the world, the most accomplished humans, at least within these certain fields. Philosophy was one. And it turns out that most of the significant human accomplishment, even according to like Chinese encyclopedias, Japanese encyclopedias, Indian encyclopedias, the most important accomplishments, like overwhelmingly come from Europe. That Europe was just this, I don't know what you'd call it, it was just this, created this genesis of just innovation and so forth. And it's almost all men. And he has a chapter explaining why it is that, there's so few women that are like in the top 100, maybe just like 2 or 3. Like Marie Curie was, of the European women, I think she was like the most influential in regard to science of all women, although her husband was more important than she was. And I think the highest ranking female across the board was a Japanese woman who lived like around the 10th century, who wrote this novel called The Tale of Genji, that she is like the most important, accomplished, influential females within these certain realms of all time. I'm sure like in politics, you'd have more important females like Queen Elizabeth I, or even like Margaret Thatcher or somebody. But his explanation is, first of all, that women are just more inclined to have other priorities in life than just obsessing on a career. Because if you're going to be at the top of your game, you're going to be a Shakespeare or like an Isaac Newton or some such, a Bach, a Dostoevsky, somebody like that. I mean, you've got to just be obsessed. You can't have a lot of other interests. You can't be like doing that and being a stay-at-home mom at the same time. So there's that. I mean, Charles Murray even says that with regard to his wife once told him that if one of our kids is sick, you can still go to work and do your job and not be like obsessing on it all the time. I can't do that. I mean, just because of the way the female emotions are wired, her kid is sick, she's going to be thinking about the sick kid all the time. She can't just go on with her day. So there's that. Plus, of course, men have a broader shaped, bell-shaped curve than women do. And also, of course, there were sociological, like, especially before the 20th century, before like the middle of the 20th century, women were just like, they couldn't get the same kind of educations and so forth as men. But it's also true that the bell-shaped curve of like intelligence is broader for males than for females in the human species. And so not only the stupidest morons, but also the most brilliant super geniuses are more likely to be men. And of course, feminists just can't take that at all. They just can't stand it. That just in just about any field, the most qualified person is likely to be male, simply because the bell-shaped curve is broader for men, so that the people, the highest extreme tend to be all male. But anyways, it's an interesting book. I've got a number of other books on my computer that I'd have to like go through my files and look through them. But those are some of the important ones. And so, I mean, that's good enough for now. I mean, this is going to be an obscenely long Q&A, especially if I don't like keep it concise. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the proto-pseudo-monk, who I haven't heard from in a while, unless he was asking questions under an alias. And the proto-pseudo-monk says, Why is the practice of yoga so vastly underestimated in Theravada Buddhism? And then he continues, I think, here. Given the fact that yoga has been around 5,000 years in India, wouldn't it be extremely likely that all the arahants in the time of the Buddha were all practicing yogis, particularly the 5 ascetics, the ones that were the ripest for enlightenment? And wasn't the Buddha probably well practiced in yoga? As the story goes, his former teachers were probably yogis. This is probably where the derogation comes from. And I'm not exactly sure what the proto-pseudo-monk is referring to with regard to yoga. I mean, yoga in general, like as a Buddhist term, it just means spiritual practice. Like any kind of meditation would be yoga. Any kind of moral self-restraint, especially at the more advanced levels of like extreme renunciation and just, guarding the sense doors and all that, that would be yoga. Yoga is like yoking or restraint. At least that's one way of interpreting the term. I mean, it has the same Proto-Indo-European root as the English word yoke. So, given the fact that yoga has been around 5,000 years in India, he's got a capital Y. And I mean, yoga as a system that is called yoga. First of all, I'm a little skeptical that it's been around for 5,000 years. I mean, that would be well back into the Indus Valley civilization. And they had some kind of yogic practices. Some of those seals they've found in like the ruins of the Indus Valley cities. They have it looks like people sitting in meditation and so forth. And there's a good chance that the Shramana traditions of ancient India, including Jainism and Buddhism and Ajivakism, had their roots in this atheistic yogic kind of spiritual system that was, it was like mainstream in the old Indus Valley civilization. So, but I mean, 5,000 years is kind of a guess, it would seem to me. And what is called yoga with a capital Y is derived from another one of these Shramanic traditions that was called Sankhya. And it's mentioned in the Buddhist texts, the Sankhya system. And Sankhya, it had its own peculiar philosophy, and it also had, meditative practices and so forth. And at some point after the Buddhist time, the Sankhya system kind of split. And some of the Sankhya philosophers, they kind of got incorporated into the Vedic tradition. They became Hindu by accepting the authority of the Vedas and accepting the existence of like a supreme god like Brahman or Brahma. And they became known as theistic Sankhya, whereas like the older unreformed version of Sankhya was just called atheistic Sankhya. So you had atheistic Sankhya, which is just still called Sankhya, and then you had theistic Sankhya, which became called yoga. And within yoga, you've got different strands. You've got Raja Yoga, Hatha Yoga, like just putting your body into pretzels. I mean, that's not even really one on the list. You've got Bhakti Yoga, or the yoga of devotion, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, Karma Yoga, the yoga of service or action, and Raja Yoga, which is generally more the Buddhistic kind of yoga of just like self-restraint and meditation and so forth. So, I mean, with regard to yoga with a small y of spiritual practice, which had its like ancestral roots in the Indus Valley civilization, sure. It's like most of these advanced practitioners were following that general tradition. But capital Y yoga, which is theistic Sankhya, first of all, it didn't exist yet in the Buddhist time. And it was just one strand of this whole prehistoric tradition, or this tradition with its roots in prehistory, of just the idea that, it's more Dharma is more important than any idea of God, that Dharma is the origin of like ethics, for example, and that this world is not a good place and we should escape from it. that kind of thing, that kind of philosophy with the spiritual practices to help you like work out your karma and so forth. It just goes back into the Indus Valley civilization, and it was like eventually evolved by the Buddhist time into Sankhya Buddhism also, although Buddhism had a lot of Vedic like terminology and ideas added, Jainism, the Ajivikas, and so forth, and there are probably lots more. So what is the question? I should probably, why is the practice of yoga so vastly underestimated in Theravada Buddhism? Well, I mean, technically, Theravada Buddhism is a kind of yoga. If you're using yoga as like spiritual practice in general, it may be the proto-pseudo monk is referring to yoga that involves asanas or the bodily postures. And I mean, the full lotus was apparently adopted by Theravada Buddhists early on, but I'm not 100% sure what the proto-pseudo monk is referring to here. I mean, there's three different ways you could interpret yoga, I suppose. Just yoga as spiritual practice in general along like ancient, like even prehistoric North Indian lines, which, I mean, Buddhism did, Jainism did, the Ajivikas did. Anyone who wasn't like a Brahmin fire-worshipping priest in the Buddhist time who was spiritual was probably going along with the Shramana traditions. Or you could have the capital Y yoga of theistic Sankhya, which didn't really exist in the Buddhist time. Sankhya did, but I mean, it was just one of many traditions to derive from this early shamanic tradition. And then you just got like the small Y yoga again of hatha yoga, of just assuming the various bodily positions and doing a few other things like fasting and water neti and string neti, where you're like using like sinus floss, you're flossing your sinus cavities and swallowing long strips of cloth and like pulling them back out again and that kind of thing. So I'm not exactly sure what the proto-pseudo monk is exactly referring to, but the same general tradition that gave rise to what is called yoga also helped to give rise to Buddhism and many others. And it's just meditation in general seems to have derived from this. So I'm not sure exactly why the proto-pseudo monk would say that the practice of yoga is vastly underestimated in Theravada Buddhism. I don't fully understand that. And so I'm just going to move on to the proto-pseudo monk's next question. He includes some sayings of Swami Satyananda that, if you want to read those, you can go back to Q&A number 130 and look in the comments under the YouTube video. So anyways, the next question is, why not integrate the practice of yoga as a preparation for Nibbana? And then he continues here, from my experience, yoga seems to do what it says, and it feels like a game changer compared to just drilling the noting method into a very distracted, dispersed, stressed out, not relaxed mind. Well, I mean, that's just not the way you're supposed to do it anyway. So deep relaxation and concentration is much more achievable, hence insight is much closer. It seems extremely logical. I don't understand why Buddhist frowns upon yoga so much. They see it as lesser, but frankly, unless you are fully enlightened, it seems to be extremely useful. Thoughts? And again, I'm not even sure what he's referring to as yoga, whether it's just the yogic traditions, which Buddha follows, with their roots in the prehistoric Indus Valley civilization, probably, or the capital Y yoga of theistic Sankhya, which, the Buddha the philosophy of theistic Sankhya really is inferior to the philosophy of Buddha, in my opinion. And then you've got this hatha yoga. So, but he seems to be implying that if you just practice Buddhism without practicing something else, you're going to have like this distracted mind. But if you really live the life of becoming a monk, like what Theravada Buddhism is based on, step number one is renunciation. Then if you practice the whole thing of Dhamma, not just Western secular attempts at Theravada Buddhism, but Theravada Buddhism, the way it is described in the texts, then, I mean, the problem is much reduced. You're definitely not going to have that much of a distracted, dispersed, stressed out mind. The distracted, dispersed, stressed out mind for somebody trying to do Theravada meditation is caused by them not practicing the whole method. They're just picking the stuff that's convenient for them. They're not doing the whole thing. So they're just picking and choosing what they're going to follow, and then it's incomplete. Surprise, surprise. So, I mean, if you're a lay person and just following everything that a Buddhist renunciant is supposed to follow just isn't convenient for you, then if something else helps, if practicing some kind of yoga, and I still don't know what he's talking about exactly, if practicing some kind of yoga helps, then fine. I mean, if it works, then go with it. If it doesn't work, then don't. Let's see. So I guess that's it for Proto-Pseudo-Monk, I think. So I'm just going to go on to the next question, which is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, is the Dalai Lama enlightened? And I mean, I discussed this in a recent Q&A, not with regard to the Dalai Lama, but with regard to a lot of people that are considered to be enlightened. Like, what's his name? Gosh, I can't remember his name now. He declares himself to be enlightened on his website, page 1. No, I don't remember his name. But there are a lot of people who are considered to be enlightened. And just because they don't seem enlightened, because they don't live up to your preconceived notions of what an enlightened being should be like, it's very problematic. There was a Buddhist school. Sometimes they were called the Yogacara logicians. They were like medieval North Indian text or Buddhist sect, Buddhist school, sometimes called the Dignaga school. They were logicians. They incorporated logic into their Dhamma, and some of the stuff they came up with was really profound. Like bare sensation with no perceptual interpretation is as though there's no sensation at all, that kind of thing, which I agree with. But they considered like the classic problematic premise is that any person is enlightened. Because logically, you can't verify that. It's just purely problematic. So is the Dalai Lama enlightened? Well, maybe. I kind of doubt it. It may be that he really is the incarnation of a long line of lamas, that he's like an avatar. And I guess the Dalai Lama is considered to be an avatar of Manjushri, god of wisdom, who is a kind of bodhisattva. You'd think that if he was the god of wisdom, he might be enlightened, but I'm not 100% sure about that, because Manjushri is more of a Mahayana being than a Theravada one. It may be that, it's my understanding that some Mahayana Buddhists will accept that some bodhisattvas are already fully enlightened, and they're still bodhisattvas, which is kind of, it doesn't work that way in Theravada. But I would guess that he probably isn't fully enlightened, but I would guess that he's wiser than the average person. But who knows? I don't know. I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, I've started to believe U.G. Krishnamurti was an arahant, even though he would laugh in my face for implying that. He even says in one interview that he is completely blown out and that people don't realize there's no one there when they're talking to him, but he does this without using Buddhist vocabulary. Thoughts? Well, this is like the same question as the previous one, except directed towards U.G. Krishnamurti instead of towards the Dalai Lama. It may be, U.G. Krishnamurti, he didn't follow any rules, and he just, he like shat on rules even more than J. Krishnamurti did. Like I mentioned before, that he sent a picture to the Dalai Lama of some porn star having sex with an elephant, with the picture modified slightly so that you could see that it was supposed to be the Buddha's mother, who had like this dream of the elephant when she got pregnant with Gautama. And I mean, so he would do stuff like that. But I mean, it could be that he really did attain something, that the ideas of what an enlightened being it has to be like is just, the Theravada Buddhists just don't get it. Theravada Buddhists say that in order to be fully enlightened, you have to be an absolutely perfected saint who never does anything wrong. You have perfect morality. And I'm skeptical of that. So I'm open-minded with regard to somebody like U.G. Krishnamurti really having attained something. But I mean, how can you possibly know? I mean, in U.G. Krishnamurti's case, he actually underwent physical changes. I mean, it's like he reverted to like a prepubescent bodily state. I mean, I haven't read the details, but I don't know. How can you possibly know that? And it may be that an enlightened being just it's not even a valid statement within a samsaric context. It's just purely problematic. And I keep getting asked these questions. Is so-and-so fully enlightened? Well, maybe. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Chameleon, who used to go by the name of Skuladeen, and now is just he's just become rudderless. He's just broken free of his moorings and is changing his name on a pretty frequently. So anyways, Chameleon says spiritual music recommendations. And then he's in the standard bullet point. He says, I liked The Keeper of Seven Keys by Halloween. It was a song about a wise sage who went up against Satan to rescue mankind. Spiritual music recommendations? Well, certainly not Buddhist, because Buddhism really doesn't have very good music. Hindu music tends to be good, and I consider Shiva to have better music than Vishnu as a general rule. So, I mean, just getting into like Indian trance music, the only kind of music that I can like type, like if like I'm editing my book, I can listen to like Goa trance music and still function, and that's about the only kind of music I can listen to without being like distracted by the music. There is a lot of Indian music it's like taking like Om Namah Shivaya and just putting it to music, that kind of thing, like Hindu mantras set to music. Like there's one, Lord Shiva and Deep Meditation, which is just Om Namah Shivaya over and over again with like electronic music in the background, that kind of thing. Or how about Shiva's India by 1200 micrograms. I mean, I don't know if you'd call it super spiritual, but at least it has a religious theme to it. But yeah, I mean, sort of like sitar music too, like ragas. Sitar and tabla is an excellent musical combination, like of instruments. So that'd be good. Like listen to old Ravi Shankar stuff. That'd be all right. Anyways, I'm just gonna move on to Chameleon's next question, which is spiritual places recommendations. And then the bullet point says, the only place I've known to be spiritual was the ocean. I've seen people I know who walk down the beach just to keep everything together. The air seems to dilute anger. And occasionally I've heard of people just abandoning society to take to the sea. Yeah, sailors are notoriously spiritual people. At least Ishmael and Moby Dick was. But in addition to the ocean, the mountains, up high in the mountains, there's a good reason why mountains are associated with meetings with God and so forth. It's not just that you're higher up to outer space, but just the clarity and silence, and I mean it has a good effect. Mountains and the shore are like the two most spiritual places, just geographically or geologically. Although with regard to specific sites, I mean, Bodh Gaya definitely it's worth going to if you're a Buddhist. So I would add Bodh Gaya to that list, or any of the four main pilgrimage places, like the place where the Buddha died also. And I always blank out that name of the place. Both names, the modern one and the ancient one. Between the two salt trees, I remember that though. So let's see here. I think I'll just move on to comma chameleon's third question, spiritual animal recommendation. And then the bullet point says, the Farmer's Almanac says to pick a pet based on your personality and habits, but I don't know what's the best spiritually. Like picking a rescue animal, they seem to have more character, or just feeding whatever animal I come across, or choosing a specialty animal like a helper monkey or a PTSD dog or an ant farm. Well, yeah, I think it would depend on just what intuitively you're drawn to, what you feel most comfortable with. Some people are dog people, some people are cat people. Like Eckhart Tolle says, he's lived with a number of Zen masters, all of them cats. Personally, I'm more of a dog person than a cat person. And you just have like a deep bond with some animal. I mean, dogs have a certain spirituality to them because they are capable of unconditional love for you that, I mean, is rare to find in a human. I mean, you can kick your dog and the dog will still love you. And you kick your woman and she might just decide that she's had enough of that. But also, just aside from any kind of like spiritual connection. And speaking of which, I've got this dog named Tater. If you've seen my Q&As, you've probably noticed Tater walking around. And I do think it's possible that Tater was like an infant who died in some previous life. You know, it's like Tater has like this personality of sort of like at least a 1-year-old child. You know, when they're still not able to speak yet, but they've already started forming like a personality. They're kind of aware of what's going on around them. I think it's possible that that this dog I've got was like a human baby in a previous life, possibly my own human baby, but I'm not sure about that. It's just a guess. So, I mean, fish in an aquarium, that's a good meditation object. If any of you have seen my aquarium videos, that really just sitting in front of an aquarium and watching the fish silently gliding around, that's a very relaxing, beneficial kind of relatively elementary meditation that a person can do. So there's that too. I wouldn't really recommend the ant farm. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. And we're getting down there. It's still going to be 3 hours, but it's fairly good. I mean, I've done some videos that were 3.5 hours with fewer questions than this. So I guess I'm doing all right. This is from KZen. KZen says, did you meditate 50,000 hours in your 30 years as a monk? And I actually got out the calculator, and it was, I mean, if you average like 5 hours a day of meditation for 30 years, it comes out to a little less than 50,000 hours. So that's just from like sitting cross-legged. That maybe sitting cross-legged in meditation, I did like maybe 40,000. I don't know. I was averaging at least 6 hours a day my first 10 years, and then it kind of tapered off. Maybe my second 10 years, it was like 4 or 5. And then towards the end, I just really had gotten as far as I could with it and was sort of definitely had lost my momentum by the time I finally disrobed. But, I mean, if you include walking meditation, I probably did 50,000 in 30 years. So KZen's second question, how many hours per day did you meditate seated? And I already mentioned that. I mean, I was averaging about 6 hours a day my first 10 years as a monk, maybe 4 or 5 my second 10 years. And then it kind of gradually tapered down. I mean, even shortly before I dropped out, it was still a couple hours at least. So, and then you include walking meditation. Like towards the end, I was getting more benefit from walking meditation than sitting meditation. So I was doing more walking than sitting cross-legged. And so let's see, the third question from Kzen. What was the longest period you spent in silence? And I'm not exactly sure. I never really kept track of how long I spent in silence. I mean, a monk is forbidden by the rules of monastic discipline from taking a vow of silence. So there is that. I mean, there are some monks, including one of my teachers, who would go wizzy bait, it's called in Burmese, where you just don't talk. Maybe just to make confession. And then, you're not taking a total vow of silence. I mean, a monk is required to make confession on occasion. But, even when I was alone, I'd live alone in a cave. I'd be talking to a stray dog or talking to a lizard. There was a kind of chameleon lizard, in fact, that I named Linda. I'd say, "Hey, Linda, how's it going?" In fact, when you're alone and you don't have anyone to talk to, people do have like a talking instinct. I remember once finding myself bending over this little weed outside my cave, saying, "Who's a good little weed, huh? Who's a good weed? Yes, you're a good little weed." And it's just, you're just talking to yourself sometimes, which isn't a good habit, but hermits notoriously talk to themselves, largely because humans do have an instinct to talk. And like babies, when they're babbling, already the talking instinct has kicked in, even though they don't really know how to speak a language yet. So what was the longest period I spent in silence? It's hard to say. A few days at least, probably. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Young Phenomenon, and this is our last questioner, and he's got 2 questions. And the first question of these 2 questions is as follows. I have heard you mention Carl Jung a few times in these videos. I would like to know what you think of the man and his work. Well, I'm no authority on Carl Jung. I have read several things by Carl Jung. I've got his essay on synchronicity on the bookshelf there. I'm pretty sure, at least I used to have it there. I've read his answer to Job, which was good. I like that. I've read some weird stuff that he wrote. When I was in Burma, I had access to, it was like the collected works of Carl Jung. And he wrote a lot of really obscure stuff about like alchemy, that I read some of his stuff on alchemy. Like it's just etched in my memory. Carl Jung wrote about, there was some alchemical sect. I don't even know what country it was in, maybe Syria or some such place, where it was like a religious cult. They were alchemists, but it was like religious alchemists. And maybe most alchemists were. It was kind of like a yogic thing, where they had this temple, and there was this tradition, I guess, that if a certain person, I think they had to be like, they have like blue eyes, maybe even blonde. They walked in, you were supposed to like kidnap this person, and then you trap them in this vat of olive oil, so that just their head was sticking up out of the olive oil. The rest of their body is just submerged in olive oil. And then all you feed them is figs that have been soaked in olive oil. And you just keep the person in the oil and keep feeding them these figs soaked in oil until their skin just becomes waxy and translucent. And then you rip the head off of this person while he's still alive. He stops being alive by the time you've done ripping his head off. You don't cut it off. You have to like pull it off. And by then it was like supposedly his whole body had just become soft and waxy from soaking in this oil for so long. Then you take the head and you preserve it in some way. It's already fairly well preserved from all the oil, I guess. You put it into a box surrounded by some sort of like cotton or kapok or something. And then you put it into this niche in the temple, and you could use it for prognostication. You could ask the head questions, and it would answer, at least to somebody trained in hearing answers from this head. So there's that. I read Psyche and Symbol as like a teenager, which was just over my head at the time. It was one of my father's books. I've read quite a lot of Carl Jung, but I've never really mastered Carl Jung's psychology or philosophy. And Ram Dass used to say that like Sigmund Freud was operating at the level of second chakra. I mean, he just kind of boiled everything down to sex. But Jung was operating at third chakra. So I've recalled that. That's some little nugget of information I can divulge with regard to Carl Jung, is that Ram Dass considered him to be functioning primarily at the level of third chakra. But aside from that, I really don't like all of his stuff about the anima and the animus and the persona that was brought up earlier. I really have never bothered to master Carl Jung's psychology, so I can't really say much more about Carl Jung than I already have. And so I'm just going to move on to Jung Phenomenon's second question, which is the very last question. And it's not even fully 3 hours yet. We're doing good. And Jung Phenomenon says, have you read the Red Book? And I do think the Red Book is on my bookcase. I got it for Christmas like 2 years ago. But like I say, I hardly ever read books anymore. It's weird. As a monk, I used to read a lot. Before I was a monk, I think I read even more. It was like I couldn't really sleep at night without reading for at least half an hour before I became a monk. And then the reading kind of got replaced by meditating. And now it's just, I just go to bed and don't have to do anything before I go to bed. And usually I manage to fall asleep pretty easily. So I do have the Red Book. I just haven't read it. And I guess the Red Book is just sort of like personal stuff that he wrote that wasn't intended for publication, but then somebody went and published it anyway. So, I mean, that's it. I finished answering all the questions, and so I'm done. Or at least I'm fixing to being done, because I just got to say the last standard stuff that I always say, like I should say it at the beginning, but I almost never do. If you have any questions about something you think I can answer, which would probably mainly be with regard to Theravada Buddhism, early, like pre-Theravada Buddhism, Buddhism in general, although some Mahayana stuff I'm not really well versed in, like Eastern philosophy in general. It's getting a little more iffy and sketchy, but a lot of the time I can answer stuff about Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy. I have a fairly good knowledge of Western philosophy, mysticism in general, meditation in general, like Burma, living in caves, biology, human evolution, that kind of thing. There's a good chance I would be able to answer questions about that. And no more than 3 questions per episode, please. And if questions continue to be as many as this time, we may go down to 2 and pray that I do not reduce it further. And if you like this video, I mean, if you made it this far, you probably do, unless you just hate watching, then smash the like button. Don't just click it or whatever. Just smash the son of a bitch. Subscribe if you haven't already, and be happy. And now I'm going to stop recording.